now.
Okay. Thanks, Allison. Okay, so here's the plan, guys and gals. We're going to talk about tree pruning here for maybe an hour, hour and a half, depending how it goes. And then afterwards, we'll talk about pruning shrubs. It's a really relevant time of year to talk about pruning shrubs, and that's one of the things that actually, as master gardeners, we get a lot of questions about is how to prune X type of shrub. And so we'll try to make that simple for you. So, but we're going to start with tree pruning. And this is a pretty basic version talk. If you hang around as a master gardener long enough, you'll get a more in-depth one at some point. I do like to start most of these talks with a question. So in this case, I'll ask, why do we prune trees? The pictures here kind of shows us that we like the thrill of using power tools and, dealing with large weights above our head and the danger and the excitement. And in all seriousness, it is, actually fairly dangerous, fairly strenuous activity. So why do we do it? After all, who prunes the trees in the forest, right? The short answer is no one, right? I mean, they don't receive pruning and they seem to get along just fine. And there are also a lot of negative things that can happen from pruning that we should be aware of before we prune. And we'll talk about them for a second before we get into the reasons why we might, or how we prune correctly. So I think it's important to know what effect you're having on a tree or shrub, particularly now we're talking about trees, when you prune. And this little cartoon here is oftentimes what happens, right? People over prune, they take too much off, and that can have negative effects on the health of the tree. A big thing we have to keep in mind when we're pruning is that we are creating entry points into the tree for decay-causing organisms. So primarily fungi, also bacteria, but fungi do most of the work as decay organisms. These are organisms that can break down the wood of a plant, break down the cellulose and lignin in the wood of the tree, and make it lose its strength, which is obviously a big deal for a tree because a tree is, like by definition, it has that trunk and it has a trunk and it stands tall, and that's what makes it different than another type of plant. So you can see in the picture here, the discolored areas of wood right here and here are right behind wounds. The discolored wood is wood that's been affected by decay organisms. And you can see the tree has, trees have defense against decay organisms, which are, depending on the species and the health of the tree, have various levels of strength. So, when we prune, we need to know that we are wounding the tree, even though it's in a controlled manner. And so we are potentially letting decay organisms in. And here's this picture of a crabapple that it still is in my front yard, although I think it's going to die. A branch that broke in a snowstorm a couple years back. And you can see this whole inner portion is affected by decay. It has a kind of a white and spongy appearance to it. This black line around the edge of that is actually the wall the tree has erected. The wall the tree has erected to contain that decay. In this case, it affected a lot of the branch, and the branch eventually broke in a spring snowstorm. So decay is a real thing. We need to worry about it. It oftentimes takes years and years and years to actually lead to the tree being damaged, to a branch breaking. So it's hard for us to remember that a bad pruning cut we made 10 years ago might be the reason that decay got into a branch and it broke in a snowstorm today. So it's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's a long-term issue and it's an important issue. Also, pruning is just hard on a tree in general. It reduces a tree's vigor, which is a fancy way of saying it just stresses it out. When you prune off a branch, you're either taking off buds that were going to become a leaf or leaves, and leaves do photosynthesis. So that's, less photosynthesis being done means less energy for the tree. So pruning reduces the amount of energy a tree can create. Also, trees store energy in the form of starches in their live wood. And that's in branches as well as roots and things like that. But a lot of energy is stored in branches. So when you prune off a live branch, all the stored energy in that branch is is lost to the tree, which if you think about it from the tree's perspective, that's pretty frustrating, right? The tree had banked all that energy, um, and it just lost it when you pruned off the branch. Um, Trees also have to spend energy in response to pruning. So they make less energy, they lose their stored energy, and then they have to expend energy to close the wounds that pruning creates, to fight decay organisms, to fix embolisms, which are bubbles in their vascular system. So, you add these things up, right? Less energy created, stored energy lost. Um, have to spend energy to deal with pruning. You can see that pruning is a pretty serious thing for a tree. It's something that maybe we shouldn't be doing lightly. And then finally, improper pruning, which is done quite often, can actually make a tree's structure worse. So on the left here, we have pruning that's done well. We've selected a central leader. We've suppressed or removed competing leaders. We've suppressed large lateral branches. I'll talk more about all that later. That's good pruning. That ultimately is going to have a net positive effect on the tree, if you're doing pruning correctly like that. On the other side of the just out of control here. On the other side of the slide here, we have bad pruning on the right. So in this case, like every branch has been tipped to shorten it, the red lines. When you take off the terminal bud of a branch, that bud was creating hormones that suppressed all the lateral buds. So when you cut it off, the lateral buds behind it grow, and you can get this real witch's broom sort of habit. Very bad structure, much more prone to failure. So good pruning, bad pruning. So, this is obviously something we can 100% avoid if we know what we're doing, but it is sometimes an unintended consequence of pruning. So all that said, why do we prune? And in fact, I would go as far to say for landscape trees, it's not that they sometimes need pruning or, they benefit from pruning. Landscape trees really need to be pruned. And that really has to do a lot with the differences between the forest setting, like the left here, where all these trees evolved, or almost all trees evolved, and the landscape setting. So if you look at those two pictures, and we don't have real-time feedback, but if you just take a second and think about what the difference is in these two photos in terms of the environment the tree is growing in. So hopefully what you see is that in the forest setting, geez, my PowerPoint I think is going for automatically because there must be a presentation timer running, I'm sorry. But in the forest setting on the left there's a lot of competition for light. And you can see that, trees have a big incentive to grow straight, one leader, one main trunk, and tall to get taller than the other trees to keep receiving light. They've got small lateral branches, very few lateral branches, very far down in their canopy, and that strong central leader. On the other hand, you can see we have this cottonwood on the in the right-hand photo over here. And for that cottonwood, you can see that's not really a landscape, right? It's a pasture, but it's the same idea. There's very little competition for light. And so lower lateral branches receive light their whole lives. They grow large. The tree tends to develop multiple trunks and be more spreading in general. It turns out trees evolve to support this forest form. This is the form they evolved to, keep upright and etc., not the form that most trees have in a landscape setting. So this landscape form, which to be honest, a lot of us, when we see, immediately think of that's a nice spreading tree, is much more prone to failure. And a lot of pruning is taking a tree that wants to have this landscape form with these large lower branches, multiple trunks, all those lower limbs are getting sunlight, having a big carbohydrate party, and force it to be more like its boring forest ancestor. So, like on the whole, if we prune correctly, pruning should be done, right? Because we got in the controlled way to control or to lower the risk of decay getting into the tree. We can improve the tree's health by removing things like diseased wood. We haven't talked about all that, or dead wood. And we reduce the chance for failure by improving the tree's structure with correct pruning. And that outweighs the negatives of letting decay, potentially reducing the tree's vigor if we do it correctly. Okay, so let's talk about how we make good pruning cuts. We'll then talk about what good structure is, and then we'll talk about how we use pruning cuts to create good structure. So generally speaking, the I shouldn't say generally speaking, almost like pretty much all the time, smaller diameter cuts are safer. And in fact, the smaller the cut you're making in terms of the diameter of branch being removed, the safer that cut is. Ideally, we're making cuts that are 4 inches or less, and really the research probably says 2 inches or less, but it's just hard to stick to that in a practical setting. And there's one real big reason for that and some other minor reasons. So the big reason is that as a branch gets larger in diameter, it has the potential to develop what we call heartwood. So the wood of a tree is, the wood of the tree is pretty much xylem, right? Like everything that's white and red in this picture that's here is xylem. Its function is to move water and dissolve nutrients up the tree and then to serve as support. The more white, the lighter colored wood is what we call sapwood. That is wood that is still alive. It can actively fight decay. It's moving water and nutrients. It does have some dead components to it too, fibers and stuff, but it has living components as well, okay? The inner wood, that's the redder color, is heartwood. Heartwood is dead. It is a 2x4 waiting to happen. The tree has abandoned it, has pulled out what nutrients and starches and et cetera that were in it that it could. It has potentially filled it with decay-resistant compounds, but they're passively laid down, they're put in place, and whatever's put in place is what's there forever. Like a redwood tree puts a lot of decay-resistant compounds into its heartwood. A cottonwood, very little. So there's some species differences there too. But in either case, heartwood is dead, so it cannot actively fight decay. It only has whatever passive defenses the tree gave it before it was abandoned. And so we really don't want to be exposing heartwood when we make pruning cuts because, again, it's really susceptible to being infested by decay organisms. So if we limit ourselves to smaller pruning cuts like we see on the left here, there's going to be a lot less risk of exposing heartwood. No heartwood was exposed in the cut made there in the picture. So that's the biggest reason to keep diameter cuts small. Larger cuts are also more prone to cracking, et cetera. But the biggest reason is we don't want to expose heartwood. So keeping that in mind, there are really only 3 types of correct pruning cuts, and we're going to go through them. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the safest sort of pruning cut. It's called a removal cut. A removal cut is simply we remove a small branch. So that would be like this branch here that my cursor's over. We remove a small branch back to a larger branch. These types of cuts have a low to medium chance for decay organisms to get into the tree, depending on if the branch has a collar. So a branch collar it's pretty much magic when it comes to pruning. It's the swollen area of tissue right here. I'm kind of highlighting it. The swollen area of tissue, hopefully you can see that, that happens where branches meet. Here it is in the drawing, this little swollen area of tissue. Branch collars are denser, so it's harder for decay organisms to penetrate them. The wood there is denser. There's more cell walls per unit area. And they also can have in them this little conical set of tissues, I guess it's just a tissue, known as the branch defense zone. The branch defense zone is an area where the tree can actively make compounds to fight decay organisms. And just a side note, trees are really hardcore. The way they decay organisms is generally by making compounds that either are waxy and just prevent decay from moving through, but oftentimes they create compounds that are toxic to the microbes. And those compounds are also toxic to the tree. So a tree doesn't like repair damaged tissue. It floods it with these, well, floods is a strong word, but it walls it off, maybe creates these toxic compounds around the margin and then seals it off. So it's pretty serious business. So what goes on in that collar to make it swollen like that is that the tissues of the parent branch and the lateral branch that have come from the parent branch are overlapping, like a shuffled deck of cards. And you can see that in this picture from Dr. Gelman's website. Dr. Gelman is pretty much the pruning guru. He's the big wig in the research world for pruning. And anyways, a lot of stuff comes from him. So this is from his website. He's got great stuff there. You should check it out. Um, but you can see the grain of the parent branch bleeding over onto the lateral branch, right? And beneath that, the grain of the lateral branch is bleeding over onto the parent branch. And so that's what creates that overlapping tissue and makes it look swollen. Um, okay, so here's a really important point. Collars are really good for all the reasons I just said. They help keep decay out. They're very strong, but they only form between a parent branch and a lateral branch that is usually about half the size of the parent branch or less. The lateral branch has to be small enough for a collar to form. If the branches are of equal size or close to equal size, a collar does not form there where they meet. There's still going to be connection between the tissues, but they don't overlap. And so that's a big thing to understanding structural pruning. A lot of what we're doing is trying to keep lateral branches small relative to the size of their parent branch so a collar will form. In terms of actually executing these removal cuts, um, if the branch is smaller than about an inch, you can just make the cut at the dotted red line. So right outside the branch collar, usually at an angle. The angle will vary depending on species, etc. But you can look for that swollen branch collar and cut right outside of it. If the branch is larger, you're going to want to get the weight of the branch off first and then make the final cut. And the reason for that is if you don't get the weight off, a heavy branch as you're cutting down can break the wood at the bottom of the cut, make the cut not clean, or in the worst case, tear the bark down the tree. So if you can get the weight off, the idea, the method for that is to make an undercut, to go out about 3 to 6 inches, make an undercut until your saw starts binding. Come above that, make an overcut, creating this little hinge between the two cuts that then breaks under the weight of the branch, and then you follow up with the cut right outside the red dotted line. When I was taught this, we were taught to make the undercut and then come down the branch a few inches and make the overcut further out along the branch. That works fine too. My understanding is this is the new version, the new recommendation, because it's less likely to bind a chainsaw. They both work. I've done them both. So I was supposed to use these arrows. So that's removal cut. It's the safest sort of cut, especially if it's on a small branch that has a collar. However, if the removal cut was large enough when we were using heartwood, the risk of decay getting in would increase. The next type of cut, which we do use a lot in pruning, especially structural pruning, is a reduction cut. So reduction cut is removing a branch that is of equal size equal size or larger back to a smaller branch. So taking off a large branch back to a smaller branch. You remove the large branch, leave the smaller branch. That's why. Sorry, you reduce the branch. That's going to confuse you guys. You reduce the size of the branch, large portion, smaller lateral branch, right? So it's literal. That's why it's called reduction. You're reducing the size of the branch. We use this cut lots of times to suppress large lateral branches or to suppress competing leaders. That would be like this cut, this cut, this cut, this cut would all be reduction cuts. Excuse me, when we're making these cuts, we essentially make them across the branch in a way that that exposes the least wood as possible. So it's pretty much straight across the branch. Maybe you'll put a small angle to it so water will run off, but pretty much straight across the branch that's being removed. So the thing to understand about reduction cuts is that there is no collar involved here, right? The collar is on the small branch, not on the large branch. And so the risk of decay getting into the tree is always higher. So we really want to be careful not to make large reduction cuts and be exposing heartwood, because again, the risk for decay is always going to be higher with this sort of cut. It also means that if we're going to need to make reduction cuts, we want to do them earlier in a tree's life when the branches are smaller. There was research done in Florida, again, by Dr. Gilman and some of his students, where they did reduction cuts and found decay columns in maples, I think as much as 30 feet down from the reduction cuts in the maples they grew. Now, that's Florida, where trees grow fast and it's humid and decay organisms are probably a little more aggressive there, but still, it's a good kind of lesson to learn. The third type of cut is kind of the cut that shall not be named, the cut that we should not be using for most of us when we're doing pruning, and that's a heading cut. A heading cut is a cut that's made back to a bud. So, you cut back to a bud, not to a union of branches, but to a bud. The issue with heading cuts is we've removed the terminal bud here. So all these lateral buds behind it are then going to start growing either this year or next year. And so you get bushy kind of witch's broom growth. It can really easily lead to poor structure. Heading cuts are primarily used in a nursery setting to help shape trees, where they'll come back and thin all the branches that show up to keep it kind of the tree looking reasonable. We might use them in a landscape setting on a young tree that has like one leggy branch that just sticks way outside the tree's canopy and just needs to come back. It doesn't have a lot of branching, so we don't have much choice along that branch, and we have to make a heading cut. But generally, we just don't want to be making them when we're doing structural pruning. So big red no. Final note about pruning cuts. If you're removing dead wood, the key to that is just to cut right outside the living tissue. You just want to err on the side of the caution. Do not cut into living tissue when removing dead wood. The tree has already started to compartmentalize and close off connections with that dead wood, and you just don't want to make the tree have to work any harder by cutting into new living wood. Dead wood can be removed any time of year. It doesn't count against like your pruning budget of how much wood you can remove. It's kind of free in that sense. Just make sure you don't cut into living wood when you're removing dead wood. So let's see. So we have one more section here, and then I'll take a break for some questions. So if you have questions, start queuing them up in the chat for me here. I'm gonna just cover one more slide, and then we'll get into them. So very briefly, before we talk about how to do proper structural pruning, let's just do some of the quicks. When should I prune? Why should I prune? How much should I prune? And as master gardeners, those of you who are going on to be volunteers, this is like probably 75% of what you'll ever have to answer about pruning. So this is important stuff to kind of try to internalize. So first of all, okay, so when is the very best time to prune a tree? From a plant health perspective, the very best time to prune is right before the trees leaf out, pretty much right about now, this time of year. And that's because right now trees are at a very high energy state, meaning they have a lot of banked energy from doing photosynthesis all last year. So a lot of energy to close wounds, to fight decay, all that. All of the tree's growth systems are also primed right now to start with the spring flush of growth. So wounds will close quicker, etc. So this is the very best time. That said, like arborists obviously don't just work in the spring because it's the very best time. They work throughout the year. And as it turns out, pruning anytime during the growing season is fine, right? If it's anytime in the growing season is generally an okay time to prune. Trees are active; they're not dormant, so they can fight decay, they can start to close wounds, etc. So during the growing season is a fine time to prune. We get a little nervous about pruning very late in the fall or in the dead of winter. Late fall pruning can lead to a flush of growth that may not have time to harden off before we get a hard frost, right? Especially with the erratic weather we've had the last few years. I think there's a risk with that. Pruning the dead of winter is risky because trees are dormant, right? So they may not be able to fight decay as well, etc. in the winter. Also, the fluctuation of temperatures can lead to cracking of cuts before trees can close them, especially if you're making large pruning cuts. So there are risks associated with pruning in the late fall and the dead of winter. However, oftentimes people choose to prune in those times because it's cheaper with most arborists to do pruning during those periods. So you just have to weigh those things in your head when you're making a decision. So early spring before the leaf out, very best. Anytime during the growing season is okay. Late fall, early winter, might want to try to avoid that, but sometimes you can get a deal with the arborists. The next question, the next piece of this is how much should we prune and how often? Something someone will oftentimes ask you. So how much we should prune, generally the accepted starting point for how much we should prune is up to 25% of the tree's live foliage. And then we can round that up or down depending on the tree's age and health. For older trees, we should definitely be rounding that down. Most people would tell you, based on the research, for a mature tree, 10% of its foliage maximum is what should be removed. Now, oftentimes we do more than that because it's expensive to arborists to come out, like the real world versus the perfect world thing. So oftentimes, because we know we're not having an arborist come out every year, we do prune more than that. Just know that purely from a health perspective, 10% is probably the guideline. On the other end, if a tree is in good health and young, we can round up to as much as 50% of a tree's live foliage can be removed from a young, vigorously growing tree. I'm not saying you should prune 50%. I'm saying you could prune that much if you felt like you had to meet your pruning objectives. On the other hand, if a tree, no matter its age, is under stress, you should prune it less, right? So if it's a tree that has a disease issue, you could start that 25% and round down to say 10 or something. If it's a tree that's under drought stress, it should not be pruned, period. We do not prune trees that are under drought stress. We wait until the drought is ended to do our pruning. The question of how much to prune is also very much tied up with how often we prune. Ideally, for young trees in a landscape setting, we'd be pruning them annually in the spring. So if you got a newly planted tree, it's become established, it's growing, we'd say prune it every year, which helps keep the amount of pruning you have to do in a given year down, right? If on the other hand, just to, for the sake of argument, like if you're a city forester and you can't get back to every tree in your city every year, right? It's just not practical. We don't fund forestry at that level. Then you're probably going to be pruning the trees more in a given setting, but pruning them less often just because that's what the practicalities of your situation call for. So with mature trees, it's really tricky. If it's a mature tree with good structure and good health, it probably just doesn't need to be pruned. Very, very infrequently, at least, just to remove dead wood. If it's a mature tree that's in good health but has a lot of structural issues, you might want to have it pruned fairly regularly every few years just to mitigate any of the structural issues. You probably won't correct them on a mature tree, but you can mitigate them. The tricky one is if you're dealing with a mature tree that has bad structure and is also in bad health. In that case, you're probably going to be wanting to work with an arborist, develop a plan to improve the tree's health and deal with the issues. And they call that restoration pruning. It's a very specialized sort of pruning. So all that's so the final piece of this when, what, why of pruning is the why. The why we prune depends on the age of a tree. For young trees, we're pruning primarily to improve structure and to get lower branches off before they get too large and they get dangerous to remove. We're always going to be removing dead wood with young trees as well if we see it, or diseased, broken wood as well. That's always the first thing we do, is remove dead, broken, or diseased wood. Mature trees have a whole different set of objectives for pruning. Their structure is already set, so structural pruning doesn't strictly apply. You use some of its principles, but it doesn't strictly apply. We'll talk a little about pruning mature trees here in a minute. So the next slide is going to start talking about structural pruning, but I will take some questions before that.
There were a couple, Eric. So the first question is, how can you tell where dead wood ends and live wood begins?
Yeah, that can be somewhat tricky. Usually, if the wood's been dead for a while, it'll be pretty obvious either by a change in color of the wood. You can do a fingernail test, so you can use your fingernail or a pen knife or something to scrape the bark and look to see if it's still green and moist. If it's green and moist is still alive, and that's probably not wood to cut into. Oftentimes on very small branches, you can kind of do a bend test. You can just kind of bend the twig in your hand, and it'll be very clear if it's dead or not. It'll be brittle. And then always just err on the side of caution. So you can make a cut and look at the cut, and if it's still all dead, you can kind of evaluate if you should make another cut further back. Hopefully that answers the question.
Kristen, I think Eric covered that just as you asked that question of the timing of pruning. Barb was wondering, Eric and Jeremy, if you could talk about pruning an apple tree or just pruning for fire blight and the best time to address cutting out fire blight and those kind of practices. So if you don't mind speaking on fire blight for a minute.
Sure, I can speak on fire blight. And Allison, I know you just worked on that fact sheet, so feel free to cut in if I'm messing up or forgetting stuff. So for those who may not know, fire blight's a bacterial diseases of apple trees. It's probably one of the most common diseases we have in trees, well, the most common disease in apple trees, but one of the most common like actual disease issues with trees along the Front Range period. And the primary way we deal with it, taking a step back. So the way, you'll notice fire blight, you'll see the tips of the branch, they'll blacken and then form like a shepherd's crook. The way we kind of deal with fire blight, primarily, there are other things you can do in niche situations, but primarily it's by removing the infested branches and getting the inoculum out of the tree. When we're doing that, we want to be very careful that we're not spreading the disease further on our tools and et cetera. So generally, the safest time to remove fire blight infested branches is in the winter when the disease is dormant. I've read conflicting things about whether your tools need to even be sterilized in the winter. A lot of orchardists will tell you no. I go ahead and sterilize my tools in the winter just because I want to play it safe. When you're removing fire blight, you generally want to come down. There's a prescribed amount of inches, but I think it's 12 to 18, but I go down 12 to 18 inches, and then I remove the branch back at a junction with a healthy branch at least 12 to 18 inches below the visible sign of fire blight. And that's because fire blight can move in the phloem of the tree further than you can visually see it in terms of the symptoms. So the winter is the very best time to remove it. If you're removing fire blight during the growing season because it's a super bad infestation or something like that, you want to be absolutely sure you're sterilizing your tools between every cut with rubbing alcohol. That's probably the best one to use with most tools. You can also use bleach, but that'll pit stainless steel tools. So we don't want to be putting our stainless steel tools in a lot of bleach. It damages them. What else about fire blight? I mean, I can give you the whole life cycle of the disease, but that's not really the talk that we're having. Did I miss anything, Allison?
No, I think you covered it. And the reason we've had bad fire blight the last couple of years, and Eric can agree or disagree, we've had wet springs. So let's hope for a dry spring, and hopefully the prevalency of it won't be as great. Yeah. There will be a new fact sheet on that for ornamentals in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And then Jay had a question about, does pruning a borer-prone tree this time of year cause wounds where borers can more easily enter the tree? So does pruning attract insects, if you will?
So two pieces to that. Yes, depending on the insect, wounding the tree when the adults are looking for trees to lay eggs on can attract them to the tree. And like emerald ash borer, that's definitely true. That's one of the most common wood-boring insects, and I believe it's true for a lot of other wood-boring insects. However, one of the misconceptions is that the pruning wound you create is going to be how the borer gets into the tree. That's usually not the case, right? So you attract the insect to the tree by pruning, sometimes by pruning when the adults are flying, but you do not let the tree in or something like that through the pruning wound normally. So if you know you're dealing with like an ash tree, you might want to hold off on pruning until later in the summer.
Perfect. Those are all the questions so far, Eric, so you can proceed.
Proceeding, okay. All right, so we are going on to talk about structural pruning. And I always put this silly meme from the internet into my my talks on structural pruning because it's just perfect. You know, this tree wants to be wild and spreading and artistic, and structural pruning is just like that. A tree wants to be spreading and have these wide lower branches, and just having the carbohydrate party. And we are essentially going, no tree. You're going to be boring. You're going to look like your forest ancestor. You're going to have small lateral branches and one trunk. And I say so, so that's the end of it. So before we can talk about how we execute structural pruning, I think we need to define what we're talking about. So structural pruning is pruning that is undertaken with young trees. And these are just from a textbook on pruning these ages. In Colorado, this all gets skewed because our trees grow so slow here compared to other parts of the country. But young trees, which by textbook definition, a young tree is 1 to 20 years old. and occasionally middle-aged trees, which is trees that are 20 to 50 years old on average. Once a tree is past about 75% of its expected mature height, like if the tag told you it's going to be 100 feet tall and it gets to 75 feet, we generally call that a mature tree. And we don't really do structural pruning on mature trees. I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's something to keep in mind. So structural pruning is done to these younger trees to prevent long-term structural defects. So you see this ash in the picture here has these 3 large trunks very low down on its canopy. That's a structural defect. The tree has survived to this point. Hopefully it keeps surviving it. But at this point, we are not going to prevent that defect, right? It's already happened. We might mitigate the risk that the tree fails, i.e. that it breaks in a storm, by lightening the loads at the ends of, by thinning at the ends of these branches or things like that, but we're never going to fix that defect. It's with it for the life of the tree. So I think it's important to recognize that structural pruning is the only sort of pruning that we do that is preventative and proactive. That's getting a little mushy with my language, but definitely that's preventative. All the other ones are reactive pruning. So structural pruning seeks to encourage a tree to have good structure. And generally there's kind of 3 major elements to good structure. Both the drawings are good structure, trees with different shapes, but they both are good structure, right? With structural pruning, good structure is defined by having a single dominant trunk to the top of the canopy. So both of these trees, have a dominant trunk. The one tree has some codominant ones near the very top. Sometimes we have tolerance for that, depending on the shape of the tree. Good structure also means that we have strong branch unions. So these are generally, this means that we want our branches to have collars, right? So we want them to be small enough that they form collars, half the size of the parent branch or less. It also means that we want them to have wide angles. Horizontal branching angles, horizontal branch angles are stronger, kind of counterintuitively in some ways, than vertical angles, right? Like branches that are more outward than upwards are stronger. The very short answer as to why that is that those horizontal branches are more strongly acted upon by gravity because they're really strong levers. So they're always fighting gravity, which means they're like always working out, right? So they're stronger because they're always fighting gravity. And then when a storm comes, wind or snow or something, they're better able to deal with it. They're kind of preloaded with stress all the time, so they're able to deal with stress when it shows up. We also, branch unions which are well spaced are also stronger. We want our permanent branches, which means the branches that we envision being on the tree forever, to be, we want our permanent branches to be well spaced. And the rule of thumb for that is you want to have about 5% of a tree's expected mature height between the branches. So if it's going to be a 100-foot tall tree one day, we want 5 feet between the permanent branches. If it's going to be a 50-foot tall tree, we want about 2.5 feet between the permanent branches. We also want them well spaced radially, so no permanent branch is directly above or below another permanent branch, right? They come out at some other angle. It won't ever be perfect, and if you're kind of a very orderly person, you may just have to accept that the spacing, they may not just be like one at one angle, the next at 90 degrees, the other one 90 degrees from that. They may be kind of wild, but we just don't want one branch coming out, one permanent branch anyways, coming out directly above or below another permanent branch. Hopefully that makes sense. And then finally, we want the tree to have a proper live crown ratio, which is essentially just saying that we want to make sure that enough of the tree is by height is canopy versus bare trunk, right? So this tree is 2/3 canopy, 1/3 bare trunk. That's essentially the ratio we want, is at least 2/3 of the tree canopy and 1/3 bare trunk. I know this says 60%. Confusingly in the literature, it's oftentimes said as 60% or 2/3. I know they're not quite the same idea, but you get the idea, right? About 2/3 of a tree's, not quite the same thing, but about 2/3 of the tree's height should be canopy and only 1/3 or less exposed bare trunk. And that's because the lower branches in the tree here are actually providing energy to help the trunk grow in diameter, right? So when you leave lower branches, trees develop better taper. So they taper outward as they reach the ground, like the end of a trumpet, and that's very desirable That's a strong trait in a tree. It's less likely to fail. So single dominant trunk to the top, strong branch unions, and a good live crown ratio. That's what we're trying to achieve. Here's some examples of trees with poor structure. That ash tree I mentioned earlier, right? Codominant trunks, that's what this picture is really illustrating, right? Many codominant trunks, be more prone to failure. Can't do anything about this now. This younger tree, which actually died several years back, but is a really good example of a young tree with poor structure, right? Lots of codominant branches. In this case, we could do something about it. We could remove some of the codominant branches or shorten them to let our dominant leader get a little more light and be the dominant leader. Here we have large lateral branches. You can see all these branches here are all about the same size. They're all more than half the size of the trunk, or at least these upper few are. So they're not going to form a collar. This tree obviously has bigger issues. Here we have a picture of a honey locust. Honey locusts are really prone to this. Like every branch in that tree is about the same size, right? So they're a lot of cultivars of honey locusts are very prone to have that fan shape. And we want, again, though, they can still have that fan shape, but we would want to come in and remove or suppress some of these branches. So again, our dominant leader would be able to, we'd have a dominant leader. I don't know if that tree has been pruned much in its life, right? Here's poorly spaced branches. This honey locust, you can see all the branches in this tree come down to the exact same spot. So when the wind blows, all the force is, or I shouldn't say all the force, but the force is disproportionately being transferred to this one spot, making it more prone to failure. Here we have an ash tree with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 branches all coming out the same spot. Again, that's not desirable, more prone to failure. On the other hand, this is a swamp white oak that has pretty decent structure. Maybe these branches aren't spaced perfectly, but they're very horizontal. They're half the size of the main trunk or less, so they have a collar. We pretty much have a dominant leader as far as this picture shows. So, you know, I'm not too worried about the spacing. As the tree goes on, we'll remove some of these temporary branches, pick our permanent branches, and make sure the branches we pick as permanent branches are well spaced. So that's better structure. Here's another oak with pretty good structure. You can see a dominant, one dominant leader. Lateral branches are relatively small, pretty well spaced, maybe some clumps that we'll deal with over time, but generally pretty well spaced. That said, if we look at the tips of all these branches, you can see they're all oriented really vertically. So they're out there in the sunlight, right? There's no other trees like a forest setting to shade them out. So they're out in the sunlight. They get a lot of sun and they're reaching towards that sun and growing rapidly. So in future years, we'll have to keep suppressing these to keep our central leader here, the dominant one. So that's a little bit about what structural pruning is and what we're trying to achieve. What I'm going to do now is go through the some steps to help you order how you think about structural pruning. All of that might make sense to you in 2D pictures on trees that you're not pruning, but sometimes when you get out there to the tree and you got your pruners in your hand, it doesn't seem quite so clear. So I'm trying to give you a structure to think about it. You can think of this as a general, like a loose list of priorities ordered from the most important thing to do when we're pruning objective to something that we might want to accomplish, but it's less important, lower down in my list. Sometimes you have to break the rules and switch around priorities, and that's kind of the art of pruning, but I'm going to at least give you a template you can use here. So when I was learning about pruning, when it really clicked for me is when I started to think of pruning as managing the growth rates of different branches. When we prune a branch and we take off half of the leaves that are on it by pruning it, right? We don't remove it all the way, but we shorten it or something. We are reducing the amount of photosynthesis that branch will do, and thus we are slowing its growth rate. We like to think of trees as these holistic organisms, right? And they are in a lot of ways. But one thing that they don't do as much as you might think is share resources between different parts of the tree. A lot of the carbohydrates that are produced from photosynthesis in a given branch stay with that branch. So if we prune off leaves and less photosynthate, less carbohydrates are created, that branch's growth rate will slow. On the other hand, if we remove a branch, if there's two competing branches and we remove one and the one that we leave now gets more sunlight because we removed the other one, it will hypothetically grow faster. So a lot of structural pruning is saying like you branch, you're getting too big. I'm going to prune some off you to slow you down. Or you're going to be the central leader. And so the ones around, the branches that are competing with you, I'm going to shorten them so you get more sunlight and are more better able to be the central leader. Hopefully that makes sense. One thing about these Zoom things is I can't see any of your eyes and I can't judge if it's making sense. So I hope it does. Okay, so that said, let's go through some kind of priorities, some strategies for structural pruning. Again, these are based on strategies from Dr. Gilman's textbook and Illustrated Guide to Pruning, and then I've kind of modified them to hopefully have them make more sense. If there's a couple pertinent questions, I'm happy to answer them now too. This is not a horrible time for questions.
No questions, Eric, but it's making sense. So
Oh, good. But I'll just imagine I'm seeing lots of eyes that are making sense.
Everybody is nodding.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay. All right, so again, if you're really into this, Dr. Gilman's textbook is the one to own. I've modified these a little bit, and I'll give you a condensed version of at the end that you can screenshot with your computer if you want. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about this like 2D drawing of a tree that I have here. Hopefully you can see some of the issues it has. We have codominant stems, right? This one and this one are competing. And then in fact, even there's some competing ones out here and here. These two here and here, I would also say are competing. So we're going to want to pick one of these stems to be our dominant leader, and then we're going to want to suppress i.e. shorten or remove the others. So you could make an argument for me for any of this 1, 2, 3, 4 stems to be the leader. You pick your central leader generally by picking some combination of the tallest and or straightest branch. Sometimes there are multiple branches that could be made the leader, and it's just pick one of them. Don't be paralyzed by like percentage points difference. Just pick one and suppress or remove the other. So I think I picked this one over here, but we'll see. So in this case, this branch is competing. I could choose just to remove it, right? I definitely slowed its growth rate because it's not there anymore. No longer competing with the other one there. I would also, and this line's not as showing up quite as well, but I'd also want to pick one of these and remove the other. This is the easiest cut to make, and in the long run, probably the most important, right? Because the longer I leave it, the bigger it's going to get and the harder it's going to be on the tree. Right now, it's just one little snip. I'd also say, some of these other branches are competing. Oh, so, I've picked a leader. Maybe there's some other ones that are competing still, but I've picked a leader and I've reduced a lot of the competition. The tree has some other issues, like these lateral branches are probably, it's hard to tell from the drawing, but they're probably half the size or greater of the main trunk. So we probably want to slow their growth rate down. So over time, they will become relatively smaller compared to the trunk. They're never going to shrink, right? But they'll become relatively smaller. So we could do a cut like that, remove maybe 50% of the leaves. It's going to grow less. And over time, it may develop a branch collar and be safer to remove in the future. Again, it gets tricky, right? Because if this branch was already bigger than 4 inches, we're going to have to think about that. We might want to just remove it outright, but I don't give you sizes in this picture, so it's hard to say. So in this case, we'll just say we're going to shorten it.
Hey, Eric.
Yep.
I think there's 2 questions, but one is Jesse was referring to this would be a removal cut. So can you maybe just clarify what a removal cut is?
Yep. So like, I know you guys can see my cursor. So this cut here, removing a hypothetically smaller branch back to a large branch, small to larger would be removal. We remove the smaller branch back to the larger branch. This cut here, where we take a larger branch back to a smaller branch, would be reduction. We're reducing the size of the branch. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, I just typed that in. And then the other question was from Terry, and their question was, how soon after planting is it okay to do structural pruning, since that also affects the roots?
Yeah, good question. I guess we can talk about it now. It might fit better later in the talk, but essentially, you can deal with co-dominant leaders. If there are two obvious competing leaders, the new recommendation is to deal with that at planting, right? Just pick one and make that cut and have your, start with one leader. But we don't do significant pruning until the tree is established, which is really going to depend on how the tree is planted and cared for. Though our general rule of thumb is a tree takes 1 year to establish per inch of diameter of trunk. So a 1-inch tree would take one year to establish. A 2-inch tree would take 2 years to establish, et cetera, right? So the larger the tree is, the longer it takes to establish after planting, and the longer you should wait to prune. But once the tree starts putting on more than like 2-3 inches of growth, like it gets up to 6, 8, 12 inches of growth a year, you're safe to prune. So
that was it. You can continue.
Okay. I may talk about it more later again, but yeah. So let's as a group just, I know I can't see your faces or anything, but let's just look at this branch over here. It's too large. We want to slow it down. Our options are to do a reduction cut to here, a reduction cut to here, a reduction cut to here, or I guess we could remove the branch altogether, although that's going to mess up our live crown ratio, probably, depending on what we do over here. So if we do this reduction cut, we remove this portion of the branch. We probably haven't removed enough of the branch to make a difference, right? If we come down to here, we're coming down to a really upward growing branch. It might be enough to make a difference, but I just don't like the angle of that branch. If we come down to here, we've removed probably 50% of the branch or the live foliage, and we've probably done enough to address the issue. So there are a couple other things we might do in this tree, like this branch here is competing. If I still had pruning budget left, like if I knew I could only take off 25% of the tree, well, I might have done that with these cuts. But if I had pruning budget left, I might address some of these other branches that are competing, but maybe not quite as strongly. Like do a reduction cut here, and then either remove or shorten this other branch right here. Which for some reason, I thought I have a red line on there, but I guess I might have messed up the order. It may show up later. So all that may seem pretty straightforward, but so I'm going to give you now the way I would try to think about this as I approached a tree with pruners in hand. So my very first priority, the very first thing I'm going to spend my pruning budget on, my 25% of the tree's canopy or whatever I've decided it is developing a strong central leader by removing or shortening, which we refer to that as suppression sometimes, or even subordinating, competing, upright stems and branches. And I would say everything in that circle would be part of this first pruning objective. We've picked our central leader, we've shortened the competing ones. Even this one probably should have something done to it. That's the very first thing you're going to do after you've taken out the dead, broken, damaged wood, which again always happens. Oh yeah, so just a quick note on suppression and subordination. A lot of people, myself included, use all these terms interchangeably. I don't want to confuse you guys by doing that. I mean, they do have meanings on their own, right? We like this branch here, we suppress its growth by taking off this red part, in turn subordinating it to the central leader, right? So they do have their own meanings, but they get used pretty interchangeably by the arborist community. Just a little side note. So, okay, so we've identified our permanent leader. We've suppressed or removed the competing leaders. The next thing we need to do does not involve any pruning. The next thing we need to do is identify the lowest branch on the tree that we are working with, which will be on that tree for life. When you buy a tree from the nursery, right, it comes home and it's 8 feet tall. It may be the case that there are no permanent branches on that tree, right? As the tree grows, you may be removing every branch that's on it, as it grows taller. So this is a point where I have to clarify how trees grow, because I do find there's always one or two people who just have missed out on this, right? So trees only grow from their tips, and they grow in diameter. So on this little tree here, the lower branches that are on the tree are always going to be at the same height, right? They're not going to move up higher as the tree grows. They're always going to be at that height. All the growth will happen from the tips, et cetera, right? So when I look at this tree, if it's, in most situations, the lowest branch that we want on a tree is going to be, if it's over a street, about 13 feet. If it's over a sidewalk, maybe maybe 9, 10 feet. If it's in a yard, it gets to be a little more of a personal choice. Maybe you want a lower branch for some reason on a tree in a yard that's not by a street or sidewalk. But in most landscape settings, the lowest branch that's going to be on the tree is going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 feet up the trunk. So that's a big digression for me just to say you need to look at the tree and find the lowest branch on the tree that you want to be on the tree forever. Because we manage the branches, branches that are going to be on the tree forever, permanent branches, different than temporary branches that we think we might one day remove. So hopefully that makes sense. So here's a good visualization of that, right? We have a young tree from the nursery that's maybe 10 feet tall. All the branches in that are temporary, besides, of course, the trunk, which is going to be with the tree its whole life. That same tree, as it's aged 10 or 15, or 5 to 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 years in Colorado, we're going to get a combination of these temporary branches that are still on the tree and some permanent branches that we intend to be on the tree forever. And then finally, the tree reaches, 30-ish plus years in age. All the lower temporary branches are removed, and then we have the permanent canopy, these well-spaced branches. At the top of the tree, we have a mix of permanent branches, and then maybe some branches like this one that we're going to shorten and maybe one day remove. So there's a mix of permanent and temporary branches in the canopy, but all the lower temporary branches are now off the tree. And this is important for two reasons. Well, probably more than two, but two big reasons. One, we manage temporary and permanent branches differently. And two, we want to make sure we're spacing branches correctly, the permanent branches correctly. So as part of that, we're going to prevent branches below the permanent crown from growing too large in either their diameter, so their diameter, or aspect ratio. And aspect ratio is a fancy term that I might not have defined, which simply means it's a branch's relative size compared to its parent branch, right? So we want to keep branches small in diameter so they don't develop heartwood, because we're going to be removing them one day and we don't want heartwood in them when we remove them. So we're going to be pruning them to keep those lower branches growing slowly, so they don't, so we can remove them safely one day. We don't expose heartwood when we remove them. We also want them to be relatively small, i.e. have a small aspect ratio, half the size of their parent branch or less, so that they will develop a branch collar, right? Because a collar keeps decay out. When we remove the branch, we want it to have a collar there guarding against decay. So we keep temporary branches small in both diameter and aspect ratio to avoid heartwood and to encourage collars developing. The fourth strategy is we want to keep all block branches, and this includes just what we talked about with temporary branches, but keep all the branches, even the permanent ones. We also want to encourage them to have to be less than half the size of their parent branch or less, so they have collar. Because even if the branch is going to be on the tree forever, we still want to have a branch collar, because a collar is strong and less likely to fail than a branch that has a collar has a stronger attachment, is less likely to fail. So keep all lateral branches, including those temporary ones, less than half the size of their parent branches to make sure there's a collar. The fifth strategy is, I actually want to rewrite this a little bit, but the fifth strategy is that we want to encourage proper spacing of branches along the leader, right? So we want to identify potentially permanent branches. We want to keep those permanent branches. We want to pick them out so they're well spaced based on the expected mature height of the tree and that they're properly radially spaced. And then we want to keep those permanent branches in the canopy. We want to follow the rule that we just talked about. So just, with step 4, we're going to keep them small in relative size compared to their parent branch. They develop a collar. But here's a question for you to think about for a second. Do we care about do we care about the absolute size of those permanent branches? Meaning, do we care if the permanent branches get larger than 4 inches in diameter? Just going to give you a second to think about it. So what happens when a permanent branch gets larger than about 2 to 4 inches in diameter? It develops heartwood, and we don't want to expose that heartwood. But because these branches we're talking about are permanent, they are never coming off, and so the heartwood in them will never be exposed. So we do not care if they get larger than 4 inches, as long as they're still half the size of their parent branch or less. and have a collar. We care about spacing mostly in the permanent canopy of the tree. Spacing is not super important to us in the in below the permanent canopy. So in a young tree, spacing and shape is not so important. We really care about spacing with the permanent canopy, right? Because the young tree, all those branches are coming off anyway. So if they look good and are well spaced for a few years, we really don't care about that, except if you care about it aesthetically. From a plant health perspective, we don't necessarily care about that. So finally, if we have any pruning budget left, we're going to deal with obvious structural defects like included bark. We refer to this as inclusions. So included bark is literally when bark is included in the union of two branches. And the best picture I've ever seen for showing that is this one on the right. Here we have a normal connection. There's no collar forming here, but I don't know why. But between these two branches, a normal connection. The wood between the two branches is connected, and there is, structural connection along the whole length of the union. On the other side, we have included bark. So for whatever reason, between these two unions, there is bark that is trapped within the union. So this is just bark on bark, bark pressing right up against bark, no connection, no strength. The only thing holding these two branches together is the wood down here. This branch is much more likely to fail than this branch. If you can't split the log like this, you can also sometimes find inclusion by looking for these elephant ears. This is just tissue growing over the inclusion, the tree trying to enclose it. And then the wind blows and it breaks, and the tree tries to enclose it, and the wind blows and it breaks, and you get this buildup of callus tissue around the inclusion. Or sometimes you can look for rolled bark. So this right here where my cursor is circling. There's bark included in this union as well, and you can see the bark just kind of rolls into the union instead of having a furrow like there is down here. So the only thing connecting these two branches is the wood down here. So we deal with that by removing or shortening one of these branches. So we either take this branch off here, or we remove some wood out the tips to lessen the weight on it so it's less likely to fail. So once we've dealt with like establishing a leader and managing our temporary and permanent branches, we could deal with some obvious structural defects if they exist in the tree. The final strategy is a tricky one because you might have to move this up in your order of priority depending on the tree that you're dealing with. So the final strategy is that we're going to maintain a live crown ratio of 0.6, so about 2/3 or greater. We're not going to raise the tree too quickly. And here we have a tree and then 3 different ways of dealing with it. So we have this tree with some lower branches we want to shorten. We want to get rid of, maybe they're in the way of a road or a sidewalk or something. This version here where the tree has been raised up really far, this is obviously incorrect. The tree will not develop proper taper. It won't, the main trunk will stay too narrow in diameter and may be very prone to failure in the future. Both of these lower versions are okay. In this case, they've left some of the very small lateral branches and removed the larger ones, getting them out of the way. In this case, they shortened the lower branches, getting them out of the way, and still left some of the smaller lower ones. So this is a little where the art of pruning comes in. The reason you might choose one or the other has to primarily do with the diameter of the branches. In the case where they were removed, maybe those branches were still smaller than 2 to 4 inches in diameter, and so they were safe to remove, so we took them off. In this case, maybe these branches are already 8, 10, 12 inches in diameter, in which case removing them is very dangerous, so maybe we just shorten them instead to get them out of the way of sidewalks and streets, but we don't remove them all the way. So you kind of have to make a judgment call there. The situation where you might want to move this strategy up your list of priorities also has to do with the size of the branches. If the lowest branches in the tree are going to eventually one day come off, like, they're at 6 feet or something, they're going to come off one day, and they're approaching 4 inches in size, you may have to move them up in the priority list to get them off before they get too large. It's a little bit of the art of pruning. It's, pretty much you have to practice pruning to kind of get a handle on when you should, play with the priorities of the strategies here. But hopefully that at least gives you some idea about that. When raising a tree, one thing you definitely don't want to do is always just remove like small lateral branches that are downward and in your way. It's super tempting to do. I've done this both professionally and in my personal life, but it can lead to long-term problems. So if all you're doing is removing these like lower growing branches, they're out of your way for this year. The branch then grows, has more lower growing branches in the new portion, and now they're in your way. So you remove the lower growing branches again. And eventually what happens is the branch these are attached to is growing and growing and growing, and it gets too large to safely remove, right? So instead, we would say when the tree is young, suppress those lower branches, and then eventually as the tree is remove them, they don't get large, remove them before they get large, or keep them small with pruning and then remove them when it's appropriate, and you can still maintain the correct life crown ratio. So we wrap up structural pruning. I'm just going to show you guys. I'm going to give you maybe a few seconds to think about this. I already showed you, so that doesn't help. We'll go back, and I'll still let you think about it for a second. I've got here three trees. Some of these have shown up earlier in the talk, but this one has good structure. Don't worry about it. Here you have two trees that on the outsides that have poor structure. I just want you to think for maybe 30 seconds on how you would prune those trees. I'm going to refill my water cup while you guys do that. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think about how you would prune these trees. Assume that you have unlimited pruning budget. You could prune as much as you want, which isn't real world, but for the sake of our example, you can prune as much as you want. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. I'm going to grab some more water, and I'll be right back, and we'll talk about what I would have done. Okay. So, excuse me. Hopefully everyone's going to have had a chance to at least form some thoughts. I'm going to flash the screen ahead and show you what I would have done. So let's talk about the tree on the left first. We had competing leaders. I'd say these are competing. This is competing. This one's not really competing, but it's a large lateral branch. That's also a problem. I'd also say that in addition to competing with the leader, this branch is a little large. So I picked a leader, in this case, this one, and I shortened all the competing leaders. I then shortened this branch, which was getting too large relative to its parent branch. I then shortened it as well. On this tree, again, competing leaders. Hard to say if any of these branches are large the way I drew this, but I either removed or shortened all the competing leaders. So, it goes from this to this, right? So the question is, could I have done that in the real world? On this tree, I'd say, yeah, probably, right? I probably took about 30% of the tree's canopy. So that was a young, vigorously growing tree. I probably could have done that. On this one, I probably took about 50% of the tree's canopy. So maybe that's more than I'd want to do on average, right? I may want to do part of this, like the most critical cuts 1 year, like this over here, maybe this one, maybe shortening some of these. And maybe instead of removing this one, I shorten it just to reduce the amount of pruning I do in a given year. So that's one example. I've got one more. This is maybe a little larger tree. Again, I'll give you just a few seconds to look at it and think about what structural defects it has and how you would address them. Okay. So in terms of structural defects, um, we have a codominance, right? Hopefully everyone's seeing that we have little codominance. We've got maybe some competing here. Maybe this one eventually is pretty vertical. Is one day going to compete? That might be of concern as well. We then have also large lateral branches here. Maybe this one's getting a little too big too. Maybe some of these higher ones are actually getting too big that we want to slow down with suppression. And I'd say that's about it. You know, I don't give you like the heights or et cetera, right? We want to watch our live crown ratio. We want to, I didn't tell you how big these branches are, which would determine whether or not you can remove them safely or not. But those are probably the main structural defects. So again, if I had unlimited pruning budget, this is one example of how I might have gone about it, right? I probably actually even should have another red line up here, but we pick our leader, remove, suppress, 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 suppress. I chose to remove this branch entirely because it's poorly spaced and very vertical. Now, if this branch was larger than 4 inches, that'd be a harder decision to make. I've done suppression here, maybe remove 40-ish% of this branch, and then some suppression on this large lateral branch too. I came back to here. Something I failed to mention earlier is that the reason I probably wouldn't want to come further down and make a cut here is that this lateral branch is maybe too small to make a proper reduction cut. The branch you come back to with reduction cuts has to be at least a third the size of the branch you remove. It has to be big enough. So I'd be a little nervous about coming down to here because it's too the lateral branch is too small. So there again, that's maybe 40-ish% of the canopy. So I could maybe do that in 1 year. And then, but again, maybe I don't. Maybe I do it over the course of multiple years. Brief comment, this branch here always upsets people. I put it in there intentionally because it's kind of downward growing and looks kind of wonky. But in terms of the structure of the tree, I don't care if it looks wonky. I mean, it's maybe not the best branch on the tree, and if I had pruning budget left, I might shorten it or remove it. But it's not the pressing issue the tree faces, unless it's like in a road or a sidewalk or something, then you might have to prioritize it a little more. So that's why I didn't remove it. It's because I was out of pruning budget. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a few things that you shouldn't do with structural pruning. And then we'll talk about pruning. And then I'll probably like pause for questions. So again, if you have questions, it's probably a good time to queue them up. So one thing we don't want to do with structural pruning is topping. And I already showed this example of where we round over a small tree. Here's this is an example with a little more mature trees. So topping is essentially just treating a tree like a shrub. We just indiscriminately make heading cuts or even not really correct heading cuts. We don't cut at a bud, but just in the middle of a branch to a tree. This is very bad for a tree, huge for decay, very stressful for a tree. And most arborists have quit doing this, at least along the Front Range. I know there's still problems in other parts of the state and country with this, but this is not best management practices. It leads to poor structure. The trees have to be pruned continually to keep this shape, and it's just very bad for a tree's health. So don't do it. Use proper reduction or removal cuts. Another thing we want to avoid is lion's tailing. So lion's tailing is essentially removing all the downward and inner branches of a canopy and leaving growing branches of a canopy and leaving only the little poofs at the end, like the poof at the end of a lion's tail. Again, arborists have really toned down. I mean, at least arborists who take themselves seriously have really toned down the amount of this that goes on. This is really bad for a tree in terms of has big implications for a tree's structural stability and its health, right? Obviously, we remove way more than 10% of the tree's canopy, so that's very stressful for the tree. And we've changed the way this tree interacts with the wind, right? We've changed all the pivot points. So now when the wind blows, all the force is coming down to some midway point here, or most of the force is, opposed to down here where it was coming before. The tree hasn't developed wood to support it at that level of force at this height. So it's much more prone to failure. Lion's tailing was oftentimes sold, and sometimes still is, sold to people as a way to help your tree come through a storm, like before a hurricane comes through or something like that, and on the Gulf Coast. But in fact, it makes your tree more prone to failure. It doesn't actually save your tree. So it's just not desirable. We don't want to do it. Okay, so putting all that together, all those different strategies together, this is kind of like the cue code, take with me out to prune a tree. It's a modification of something we have in the garden notes. So when I approach a tree, the first thing I would do is remove the dead, damaged, broken, rubbing branches. Always do that. Deadwood's free, but if the branches are living, they have to count against your pruning budget. We're then going to select the leader. We're going to remove or shorten competing branches. We'll pick the lowest permanent branch, and then we'll manage potential permanent branches to keep them small in aspect ratio, 0.5 or less, and we'll manage temporary branches to keep them relatively small in size, so aspect ratio 0.5 or less, and a diameter of less than 4 inches, and remove them before they get to that size. So if you got screenshot on your computer, you can screenshot this. I think we're going to post this as a video, at least for a while, so you can come back and get the video too. But if you want to take a screenshot of that, that's the one I would, that's the slide I'd capture. I'll leave it up there for a second while everyone frantically figures out how to take a screenshot. Okay. So very brief talk about how you would use this information as a master gardener. It's a very difficult conversation to have with the client over the phone or email when they ask you how to prune their tree, right? Communicating all of this is probably too much to ask. Instead, I would focus on communicating the big points, like when you prune it, how much to prune, don't prune too much, those sorts of things. And then I would also, you could maybe tell them you want your tree to have one central leader or one dominant trunk. They might understand that. And you might want to remove the lower branches before they get too big, but not too fast, like things like that. So hopefully, as you've taken all these trainings, you're thinking in your head how it'll translate into working with the general public. But those are some of the things I would focus on when I talk to the general public about young trees. For mature trees, if you're dealing with the general public, you're pretty much, if they have a mature tree they want to prune, you need to be telling them to contact a certified arborist. Most of us do not have the proper skills to do pruning on mature trees, the proper skills or equipment. It is very dangerous. It is one of the most dangerous careers that you can get into, right up there with fishing for, crabs like those people on TV. Very dangerous career. You can help them find a certified arborist by having them, there's two general ways. One, they can go to the International Society of Arboriculture's Rocky Mountain chapter website. If they just go Rocky Mountain ISA, they can find that directory if they just Google Rocky Mountain ISA. And that can work all right. They have a directory of arborists there that you can contact. Probably a better method, though, is to have them contact their city forester, whichever city they live in, have them contact their city forester. Their forester will almost always keep a list of arborists that are licensed to work within their city. And that licensing process usually means they have to have a certified arborist on staff. They have to be licensed and insured. They have to pay a small fee. Usually it's just like $25 or something. And then they also usually have to, they sometimes have to pass a short exam proving their competence at pruning, depending on the city. So I think that's the absolute best way to get someone in touch with a certified arborist is to have them contact their city forester. That said, a few basic things to know about pruning mature trees. As I've already said, they're way less tolerant of pruning than young trees. They tend to be at a lower energy state. They have to maintain all of this vascular tissue between their leaves and roots, and that takes energy. So they tend to have less stored energy, waiting to respond to pruning. Also, pruning wounds tend to close more slowly with mature trees, particularly pruning wounds in the interior of the canopy because there's less leaves there and thus less photosynthesis going on and less energy produced to close wounds in those areas. So again, 10% or less from a plant health perspective of their canopy should be removed, although in the real world, oftentimes we do more. The big thing is get a certified arborist. There are probably about a half dozen different types of pruning that I could talk about with you guys for mature trees, but I'm just going to talk about two. The two that I think are generally the most common and the most important to know about. The first is the most common type of pruning mature trees get, and it is probably the most important to know about. And that's cleaning. So in cleaning, our objective is to remove dead or diseased wood, rubbing branches, suckers, water sprouts, etc. And so you can see examples of all that in the picture here. It's the least invasive, and it's probably the one that most mature trees really need. The other that I want to talk about is thinning, and thinning is a little trickier. So thinning is removing branches at the edge of the canopy to allow more light and air to pass into and through the canopy, with the idea that that's going to make the tree less likely to fail. It's going to reduce foliar diseases, and it may increase the taper of interior branches, so it may make them thicker because more sunlight's getting in there into the interior, and thus there's more photosynthesis happening there and more energy to grow them in diameter. All that sounds good. But the thing about thinning and why it's become somewhat controversial is the benefits of thinning are super short-lived. You thin a tree, you cut out a bunch of branches immediately, maybe even that growing season, definitely the next growing season, new growth starts. And so the tree gets denser again, and all those benefits, the benefit from the pruning is reduced or eliminated. So generally speaking, with thinning, I think the take-home message is that most trees don't need to be thinned. It's probably just for trees that are in at a higher risk of failure. So, they have decay in them or something like that, and you need to reduce the risk of failure, or they have reduced rooting area, like all those trees planted in the downtown areas that are in those tree coffins. A very windy site might also be an area where you thin a tree to reduce the risk for failure. But most trees really do not need to be routinely thinned, which is kind of a change in thought. And some arborists, struggle with that idea, maybe because it's the most common type of pruning they do. Gets them back to a client year after year after year to thin the tree every year. But I think the consensus is pretty much shifted that thinning should not be routine practice anymore. It should be in specific situations. So before I do questions, I'll just do a very brief section here on tools. I'll start with this picture, this very confusing picture of this man chainsawing. He's so happy his truck got crunched. Maybe it wasn't his, I don't know. But you can see in this picture too, decay in the center of this tree as well. So I have this slide in here mainly just to talk about chainsaws and to say that, my public service announcement about chainsaws is they are a very dangerous tool. Most of us in the type of pruning that we should be doing on our trees, which is structural pruning on young trees, do not need a chainsaw. If you own, it's probably the most dangerous tool in your garage. If you ever witness a chainsaw accident, it's something that'll stick with you for life. And there are tools that are almost as easy to use. So unless I'm doing a bunch of pruning of fairly large branches, I don't use a chainsaw. And hopefully what I said just kind of struck a chord with you. A bunch of pruning of fairly large branches. From a tree health perspective, I should not be doing a bunch of pruning of very large branches, right? So if you need to use a chainsaw for a specific thing, I'm not telling you not to. Just be very cautious using them. It's a very dangerous tool. And there are a lot of other good tools out there. A good set of pruners, you can deal with the branch, depending on how strong your hand is, maybe up to 3/4 of an inch. Some people that might be a little big. These are bypass pruners where the blade slides past the anvil. That's the very best type to use for pruning trees and shrubs. These are anvil pruners where the blades meet and just kind of crunch. I don't really recommend anvil pruners for anything. I don't actually have a great understanding of why they exist. Some people say they're for deadwood or for deadheading things. They don't work any better for that than a sharp bypass pruner. For larger branches, you have options. You have loppers. I think loppers are okay if you're doing a branch an inch or so in size. If it gets much bigger, though, I don't really like a lopper because it really pinches the branch. They have those big handles, which are all there to provide leverage for you to put more force on the pruning blade, which means the branch tends to get pinched, and it can separate the cambium from the xylem and allow pathways for decay, et cetera, to get into the tree. So I'm a little leery of lops with trees anyways. What I do like razor saw. So razor saws have teeth that are sharpened to razor sharpness. They're sharpened on 3 edges, and they cut on both strokes. Used to be they were super fancy. You could only find them at landscape supply companies. Now you can buy good razor saws even at big box stores. A good razor saw is fantastic, right? It doesn't require any physical strength. It's not the pressure you put on it that does the cutting. It's all the motion of the blade. Now, of course, going back and forth with your arm for 15 minutes is not a motion most of us are very good at, so it will tire your arm that way. But a razor saw, even a lot of arborists, you'll see climbers and people working from bucket trucks using razor saws instead of chainsaws more and more these days, because it's just a lot safer for them, right? Climbing a tree with a chainsaw is a little more nerve-wracking than climbing it with a razor saw, and they're so good. So that's my favorite tool for larger branches is the razor saw. If you're working, so sometimes when you do pruning at higher levels up in the tree, and if so, you need to be very cautious, right? Especially if you're pruning out large branches. Heavy weights above your head, the potential for them to fall or swing and get you is high. That's a very risky situation. Never prune large branches from a ladder. The risk of swinging branches hitting your ladder is just too high. Small branches, like in this tree here, if you're doing a little work on this fruit tree-ish situation, or a small tree you're doing structural pruning, ladder's fine for that. But if they're big branches, be very cautious about it. The very best type of ladder is an orchard ladder, which are these tripod ladders. They let you slide them pretty close to the tree. You can also get a pole saw or even a pole chainsaw these days. Be very careful with the pole chainsaw. This one has a blade and a pruner here that pulls when you pull the string, or that cuts when you pull the string. And that's obviously not the most accurate way to make a cut, but sometimes it's the best we got. So I'm going to go on and talk about shrubs, but are there any questions about trees at this point? Let's see.
So Eric, Jay had wondered if you would be able to cover evergreen pruning, and I think you had maybe hopefully tried to play that in. I don't know. Pruning is a multi-week topic.
Yeah. We can see on the time on evergreens. It depends. I mean, I hate to make problems. I probably, let's see what time it is.
It's 2:28
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. So we probably have time to either do shrubs or evergreens. I can talk a little about pruning evergreens when I do shrubs for sure.
We could do a poll and see what people would prefer to hear about.
Yeah, if that's what you guys want to do, I can do either.
I'm just kidding.
Evergreens, to be honest, evergreens is a really short topic. Like I have a whole talk on it, but the short answer on evergreens is that they don't tolerate pruning very well. And so you want to plant them in a spot where they don't have to be pruned. If you do need to prune them, you want to prune back to a union with another branch. If you want to prune back to another branch when you can. Some tolerate shearing, like junipers will tolerate some shearing. Arborvitae will tolerate some shearing, but if you over shear them, they're going to get thin. So yeah, I mean, I'll talk, if we have time, I'll do a quick run through pruning evergreens. The other question people always have about evergreens is raising them. And I'll address all those things in the chat here in a second, but raising evergreens, you can raise them. I would just raise them slowly. If you have to. If you raise like a big blue spruce, if you raise it too rapidly, you can increase the risk of failure. And I would not raise them too high. More than about 6 to 8 feet off the ground is too high. It's going to increase the risk of failure. So that's like 45 seconds in evergreens. And if we have time, I'll do more on that.
And what I can do, I can paste the evergreen, I think we have evergreen pruning garden notes or fact sheets. I can paste those into the chat for those who want to talk about it. Kay had a question on any info you can give on removing suckers. She cut out an overgrown sucker that was the size of a small bush. It was growing from the root system next to the cottonwood. She's concerned that the wound that she did at the soil level will be an opening for disease.
Right.
It's a big sucker.
So yeah, so suckers are complicated. Suckers and water sprouts are a complicated topic, actually, surprisingly. So water sprouts are so both suckers and water sprouts arise from either adventitious or latent buds. So that means buds that either the tree made in response to wounding, that'd be adventitious or something like that, or stress, or latent, which means that they were along a stem, they never opened, and then the tree grew over them, either a root or a stem above ground. They are structurally unsound, like they don't have a strong connection to their parent until they've been growing for a number of years. I mean, it could be many years, 5-6 years, depending. And so what we call them water sprouts if they're in the canopy, and suckers if they come from the roots. In the canopy, if we have water sprouts that are really vertical, we remove them as quickly as possible. You can remove them just during the growing season as you see them. If they are yeah, so if they're, so you want to remove them when they're small, right? If you have a lot of storm damage and you get suckering from storm damage, you can leave those suckers, leave some of them, right? To reestablish the canopy, you'll thin them out so they're properly spaced. Don't let them all go, but you can leave some if they're like a bunch of suckers in response to storm damage. But otherwise, we generally have very little tolerance for again, I get my tongue all tied, but water sprouts in the canopy. If they're coming from the root system, we call those suckers. And again, they should be removed, and just remove them as quick as you can. If they're coming from the root system or from below the permanent canopy, we have no tolerance. We remove them immediately before they get large. They can definitely be entry points for decay, so you just want to get them off when they're as small as possible. Usually once a tree has started having water sprouts or suckers from a particular location, it doesn't stop. You can remove them, but they'll just come back. Whether you should have left the huge one is it's really difficult to say, right? It's not strongly attached, so it's gonna be more prone to like break in a windstorm or something. So you might have done more good by just getting it out of there. It's just, there's a lot of like factors that go into that. So it's kind of hard for me to say without like being there and looking at it. But generally when they're small, it's always better to get them off. And when they get larger, you just have to make a judgment call. So.
And then overwhelmingly, please do shrub pruning. And in response to Sandra about pruning fruit trees in espalier, that's a whole other subject. But Susan Carter from the Grand Junction area from Tri River just did a class, gosh, was it last Thursday, Eric? I lost track. Anyway, she did a class on fruit trees, and it's posted on CMG Online, which Katie just sent out some information. So go to the CMG Online, enter the Colorful Colorado password, scroll down to fruit trees, or I think it's tree fruits, and then that will be up there so you can grab that. But fruit tree pruning is a totally different concept than ornamentals, so we can't cover that today.
Yeah, it's too long. A lot of these things will apply like in terms of like how to make correct cuts and everything, but with fruit trees, we have a whole different objective, right? It's not to have a structurally sound tree, it's to have a tree that makes a bunch of fruit. And so it's a whole different ball of wax. And we just don't have time. So is there
that was
anything
it,
else?
Eric. No, just they want shrubs. Okay, should we take a break though for a little bit?
Sure. What's just we can just whatever you want to do. 5-10 minutes. 10.
Sure. So we come back at 2:45.
Okay.
I'm going to pause the recording and go.
All right. So let's bring this up. Oops. Okay. So we are going on here to talk about pruning shrubs. And I kind of jokingly titled this talk, Stop the Senseless Shearing, because this is unfortunately how we treat a lot of shrubs. And by the time the talk is done, you'll understand why I don't think that's a great idea for most shrubs. So just like we asked why we prune trees, why do we prune shrubs? Is it to annoy our neighbors? Is it to escape your spouse on a Saturday? What reason do we have for pruning shrubs? Well, it varies a lot depending on the type of shrub that we're dealing with. Shrubs can serve a lot of purposes in the landscape, and we want to prune them in a way that maximizes their purpose. Some shrubs we plant for their ornamental features, so we we prune to maximize flowering. Others are supposed to be hedges. Those we might shear. Sometimes we're pruning to get a shrub back into like a correct size, like these lilacs here that have eaten this house, right? They used to probably be, some cute little lilacs by a house. Now it's some lilacs that contain a house. And so we might prune to, bring them back into line. Either way, though, before you prune, you always want to determine what the purpose of the shrub is, because the different pruning methods I'm going to talk about will affect a shrub's ability to kind of do its job in the landscape differently. So like this shrub, what's it for? Maybe a barrier, looks like flowers primarily flowers, and it looks like a screen maybe for a park. So, we want to prune in a way that respects that keeps them being an effective screen and maximizes flower production. Same thing. So here's another example. This is a small evergreen, nearly evergreen shrub. This is Daphne. And, we plant that primarily for the good smelling flowers. So we want to prune in a way that, make sure, in fact, they've been very little pruning to be honest, but prune them in a way that maximizes flower production. This is obviously a hedge. This is not Colorado, right? It's an arborvitae looking Colorado. But we want to prune in a way that keeps them dense and allows them to be a hedge. So hopefully that makes sense. And I've got two different landscape situations here that I can get straight at this point. So we have on the left here, this is a border planting. Whether you like the plant material or not, they probably planted this here to hide the fence, right? And I think it's a pretty decent planting. Tall stuff in the back, short stuff in the front. That's good landscape design as far as I'm concerned. That's about as far as I go. Pretty decent planting, right? So I'd say those shrubs are doing their job. Over here, we have a snowball bush viburnum, which is flowering and looking lovely. It's planted in a poor spot, so it's taking over the sidewalk and all that as well. But generally, this shrub is doing what it's supposed to do, have a set of showy flowers in the spring. So shrubs that are working, right? Well, here we have kind of the opposite situation. So again, we have an HOA border planting of shrubs, probably to hide the fence, right? And you can't tell from the picture, but this is 9 bark in the back, currants in the front. Actually, they did a pretty good job of putting tall stuff in the back, short stuff in the front, but the landscape management company is shearing them all into a square. So, if the function of these shrubs was to look pretty and hide the fence, they're not doing that, right? And so, because the way they're being pruned is impairing their ability to kind of do their job in the landscape. And then, just like our snowball bush viburnum, these plants here, all these shrubs are snowball bush viburnums. There's some problems with this planting, like it's way too close to the sidewalk, it's way too dense, etc. Primarily to probably hide, it was put there to hide the electrical box and to provide interest and maybe hide the fence a little bit behind it too. But they're being sheared within an inch of their life, right? Snowball bush viburnum flowers on old wood. So by shearing them all the time, you're shearing off the flower buds that were on that old wood, and it's not going to bloom as much. They look very funky to me. Just that's probably a personal thing, and they're really not even hiding the electrical box anymore. So again, by pruning them improperly, these shrubs are not doing their job. And I look at this and I think, why do you have shrubs there? That's hard to maintain, it's expensive to maintain, and they're not doing anything for the landscape. And that's because they're being pruned improperly. So before we go on, when we're pruning shrubs, I think it's best to break, you can generally break shrubs down into 3 categories. And for our purposes, really, we'll only be able to think about it for 2. But you have shrubs that we plant primarily for their ornamental features, which should be mainly flowers, but also maybe fall color. Sometimes the color of the twig is important, like red twig dogwood. So you have these ornamental shrubs. I'm going to primarily just refer to them as flowering shrubs because that's the main feature. The other type are the ones that form barriers, so hedges or screens. And we're going to prune those 2 differently. So let's just talk a little bit about the considerations for both. For flowering shrubs, we are pruning to maximize the flower show. That is goal number 1. And to do that, we have to understand on what age of wood they produce flower buds. It's also important to understand that in general, older shrubs and older, thicker, woody stems of shrubs tend to flower yet less than younger, more vigorous stems. And generally for these flowering shrubs, shearing is a bad idea because you're indiscriminately taking off growth or relatively indiscriminately taking off growth, which means you're probably removing flower buds when you're doing that and you're reducing the flower show. We break flowering shrubs down into 2 groups. What we call spring flowering shrubs, which are shrubs that bloom on old wood. So the cycle works like this. In the spring, there's a flower. So in the spring, there's new growth, right? On that new growth are flower buds. Those flower buds then hang out all summer. They hang out all winter. They get chilled in the winter, and those flower buds open the following spring, right? So the buds are produced in one year and flower in the next. And so this picture illustrates spring flowering shrubs pretty well, right? So this is a lilac, and what's going on here is that obviously they're shearing it to keep it out of the sidewalk and the walkway. And when they do that, they're taking off taking off all the flower buds that are produced. And so the next spring, there are no flowers down there because the buds all got sheared off and taken away to the compost bed or the landfill or something. And the top of the shrub, where they can't reach, or they don't care to reach, they're not shearing, and so the flower buds are staying on the tree through the summer, through the winter, and then opening in the spring there. So that's a good example. Other spring flowering shrubs include quince, forsythia, a lot of the cherries, and others, right? But generally, these are things that bloom early because the buds are produced in the previous year and are just ready to open in the spring. The other general type of shrub, flowering shrub anyways, is summer blooming shrubs. So summer blooming shrubs have a little plan. In the spring, new growth is produced. On that new growth are flower buds, and those flower buds open that summer. So they're produced in the spring and open that summer. Examples of that would be hydrangea, blue mist spirea, Japanese or bemaled spirea, and a host of others. So whether a shrub blooms on old wood, so spring flowering, or new wood, summer flowering, makes a big difference in how we prune them. For spring flowering shrubs, we let them bloom, we prune them. There's then new growth that has the flower buds for the next year on it. For summer flowering shrubs, timing is less important, so we do it when it's best for the plant's health. So we prune them in the early spring before they leaf out, just like with trees. Doesn't matter how much we prune because there'll be new growth that year, which will be that year's flowers. You can shape or thin both of them. I'll talk about shaping and thinning later. If you rejuvenate spring flowering shrubs that flower in old wood, you have to accept that you'll have a year without flowers. So rejuvenation, I'll talk a lot about in a second, but it is essentially cutting a shrub back to the ground and kind of starting over, letting it come back from the base. And if you do that, you're cutting off all the flower buds. So hypothetically, you're going to miss 1 year of flowering, depending on how you time it. Some flower buds you can cut down all the way to the ground spring. You can rejuvenate them, and they'll come back from the base, and on that new growth will be flower buds that'll open that summer. So we don't have to worry about it. So we'll talk more about all the different pruning methods here in a second. So that's a rundown of flowering shrubs. If you're questioning whether a shrub is spring or summer flowering, there's one really good, nearly foolproof trick to figuring it out. You take out your phone, you open up Google, and you Google the shrub that you're looking for, and you should be able to find out that way. You don't have to memorize it all. But failing that, you can look at just the bloom times. If it blooms sometime before the middle of May, even towards the end of May, it's probably a spring blooming shrub. If it blooms after end of May, it's probably a summer blooming shrub. Okay, so the other major type of shrubs are the barrier shrubs, the screens or hedges. So again, this is not Colorado. Arborvitae don't look like that here, but so screens and hedges are different things, and we manage them very differently. A screen planting is something that's informal, like those viburnums I had earlier. It's used to divide a space, block a view, and it's very low maintenance. I always think of Ohio and the Midwest when I think of screen plantings. And a lot of people who don't have fences in their backyards, they just have shrub rows that divide their backyards. And those would be screen plantings. They're generally more natural looking and very low maintenance. A hedge, on the other hand, is like the exact opposite. It's sheared. It's a very formal thing. It has to be sheared consistently to keep it looking neat. It's very high maintenance, and not every plant will tolerate being made into a hedge. So screen plantings require very little pruning. Hedges, however, require very specific pruning, and this is a really good example in this picture. you can see how the base of this hedge is wider than the top. And so you can see why that matters. This picture kind of illustrates that, right? So if you prune the hedge into a rectangle during the middle of summer when the sun is high, the bottom part of the hedge is actually shaded out somewhat by the top part of the hedge. So the hedge stops growing dense foliage down there and makes the hedge look patchy. Because why would it be maintaining leaves where there's no sunlight? If you leave the base wider, then the base is struck by the sunlight, even during the height of summer, and so the shrub maintains leaves down there and stays denser. So we want to prune our shrubs to kind of have that wider at the base than top shape. Okay, so those are the two main types of shrubs, and some of the basic considerations. We're going to go through now some of the pruning techniques, and I may even show you guys a short video. I think I can do that here of us doing some shrub pruning. So there are 4 real pruning methods for shrubs, and then a 5th method, which is not really pruning, but another option. So we're going to go through them one at a time here. We're going to start with branch by branch shaping, also sometimes called individual branch shaping. This is essentially pruning that's done to reduce the length of like wonky branches that are growing outside the canopy, like here, reduce them back into the canopy, right? Makes the shrub look more uniform. Yeah. So it keeps plants with uneven habits uniform. And the example I always think of with this is forsythia. It's like they always just want to have one branch in a forsythia that it goes like 3 or 4 feet outside the canopy and just kind of hangs out by itself. And this is a really good way to bring it back into the canopy. It can also be used to reduce the size of shrubs, but keep them like natural looking still, opposed to shearing, which creates that very unnatural uniform shape. Almost all shrubs tolerate it, so you can use it on almost any shrub that you want. However, there are some things about this that we need to keep in mind. Over time, because we're only doing pruning at the edges to bring branches back into the canopy, the main branches of the shrub get larger and larger and larger, thicker and more woody, and over time they will bloom less. So over time, it is not optimal for flower production. It's also time consuming and requires thought. Like you have to think about each one of these cuts. It's a very thought and time intensive process. So you got to keep that in mind as well. On the other hand, you could do annual thinning, where this does in fact encourage new growth from the ground and so better for flower production. So with annual thinning, which is sometimes called renewal pruning, you remove 1/3 of the shrub's stems at their base every year. You want to try to remove larger, more woody stems. You really worry about sucker as much, the new growth. Focus on counting and removing 1/3 of the older woody stems. So on this one, you'd count them up and say there's 16, you remove, or that's a bad number. So there's 18, you remove 6, right? Small branches like this, lots of new growth every year. These are the sorts of shrubs that really respond to thinning. Here's an example of thinning with a wayfaring tree viburnum. This is beforehand. I can't remember how many we counted up now, but I think it was either 9 or 12. So we moved either 3 or 4. And here's afterhand. You can see there's 4 cuts here, and I think 1 more on the other side. So maybe we counted more. So again, again, before, after. And you can see how much more light is reaching the ground there. That's one of the great things about thinning is it opens the shrub so more light reaches the ground inside the shrub's canopy, which encourages new growth from the base, which is then going to bear more flowers because it's young and vigorous and not old and woody like the other trunks. So here's the same shrub starting beforehand and then after thinning. And again, you can see the shrub's shape is just the same, but it's a lot more light is passing through it and it, reaching the interior of the shrub. So annual thinning, like I already said, encourages new growth from the ground. So it keeps the shrub producing new shoots, which will be good for flowering. I really like to think of annual thinning as like pressing the pause button on a shrub. When a shrub gets the size you want it to be, you can thin it like this every year and keep it about that size and still it'll flower profusely. It's the pause button. What it will not tell you, however, is take an overgrown shrub and make it look not overgrown. If you thin an overgrown shrub, it's still going to be large and overgrown, but it's just going to be thinner. So it doesn't work for that. It works well for many, many shrubs. It may not work well if you're dealing with a shrub that just has 1 or 2 woody stems, no suckers from the base, things like that. So for example, in this picture on the left, I don't see any suckers from the base. I just have very few woody stems. I don't know that even if I thin this, it's going to respond very well. Also, on below the rocks is probably landscape fabric for keeping suckers from coming up. On the other hand, like this, I believe it's either lilac or a cherry. If I were to thin this, because I see all these suckers, it's a really good sign that it's going to respond well. Most shrubs, though, will tolerate thinning. It's a very safe sort of pruning to do. The next type of pruning is the really dramatic one that oftentimes upsets people the first time they do it, and that's rejuvenation. So this is where we prune a shrub back within like 3 to 6 inches of the ground. We do this, we ideally, from a plant health perspective, do this before the growth starts in the early spring. So here's some really dramatic pictures of that. We have another wayfaring tree viburnum, and there it goes. Here it was. Now it's a pile of branches. So just to prove to you, this is that spring. That shrub did leaf out from the base, even though we cut it back all the way to the ground. So some shrubs respond to rejuvenation really fast. Like they'll put out 2 or 3 feet of growth within a few weeks. Others, it takes a while. Like these viburnums took 2 to 3 years before they really were robust again, but they did come back. So rejuvenation works really well on fast-growing shrubs that have a lot of little branches at the ground level. It kind of takes, it's where if renewal pruning is like pressing the pause button, rejuvenation pruning is like pressing the reset button. It'll take an overgrown shrub and make it look and act younger again. It's quick and pretty easy. There's nobody that can't be trained to do rejuvenation, right? It's just cutting the shrub back to the ground. You can have anyone do it. It's not hard. Unfortunately, there are some limitations with this, right? Like some species just don't respond well to it. Either they have 1 or 2 big stems, like smoke bush tends to have just 1 or 2 stems. It won't usually respond very well to rejuvenation. There are some other examples I'll show you here in a second where rejuvenation may not work out really well. It can also be hard to sell to your clients as master gardeners, right? When you tell them you want them to cut their shrub all the way to the ground, they might kind of give you that what face. So there are some limitations with it. But if you want to take a shrub like these, which have this really unnatural shape, and make them look natural again, rejuvenation is about your only option, because if you just quit shearing them, they're going to look like troll dolls, right? Like this dense mat with this kind of bunch of hairs up top. So it's good at taking an overgrown or improperly pruned shrub and making it look normal again. But again, if you only have few stems, or you have like landscape fabric like in this photo preventing suckering, rejuvenation may not work really well. If you just have a lot of rock mulch even without landscape fabric, it may interfere with regrowth. It will also not fix problems that aren't related to being overgrown. Like these potentilla really look so crummy because they're growing in the shade. They're a full sun plant. So there's a tree behind there that is now covering them. They probably got more sunlight when they were younger, and now they're getting shaded out. Rejuvenation won't fix them. You need to pull those out and replace them with a more shade tolerant plant. The same thing would go for drought tolerance. If you have a shrub that's looking bad because it's not getting enough water, rejuvenation is not going to bring it back. So, an option is, if you can't rejuvenate, one option is just to replace it, like I already mentioned. We also are not going to rejuvenate grafted plants. So grafted plant, remember, is a Frankenstein plant where you have a different rootstock literally grafted on, connected to the desirable scion wood. And if you cut those back, sometimes you get the rootstock coming back, which may not have the desirable features of the grafted variety. Like roses are a really good example. You rejuvenate some grafted roses, you might get the rootstock coming back, which could be a shrub rose or more of a wild rose, not the hybrid tea or grandiflora or whatever you planted. We didn't used to have a lot of grafted shrubs, but I'm seeing more and more of them on the market. There's all these Rose of Sharons that are grafted now, and et cetera. So just be careful before you rejuvenate grafted plants. So here, again, to compare renewal and rejuvenation, one's gone and one's thin. I think what I'm going to do real quick is try to share with you guys a video, and I closed Firefox for some reason. Hang on, we'll bring up the video here. If there's any questions now, it'd be a good time to be typing them while I bring this up. And Allison could read them to me too if she wanted, if there are any.
There are no questions at this
Just
time.
that good.
You are that good. That's right, Eric. They might be typing as we speak. I don't know.
Okay. Hang on, guys. I closed the window for some reason.
Actually, now there is a question. Someone does agree. Kristen Anderson agrees that you are just that good. There's a couple questions now. So if an old branch on a lilac was pruned 2.5 feet high, and now new shoots are coming out high on that branch, what should you do? So it sounds like maybe the growth is a little taller than she wishes. If I'm reading that right, Kim, if you need to explain that more, please do.
Okay, hang on. Let me read it.
Or you can answer this one probably too. You can go back to Kim.
Sounds like it may have been okay, so if you've cut the shrub, so it sounds like to me like it may have been like the height of the shrub may have been reduced by cutting in the middle of a stem. That's the way I read that.
Old stub looks bad.
Old stub looks bad. Okay. Well, I mean, the easiest solution is to take it all the way back to the ground, and then you won't have to look at it. So if the lilac is suckering from the base, you can be pretty sure that if you take out the woody stems, that new growth will come over and eventually replace what you're removing. There's no way to make it like less of a stub, right? It's always going to look like a stub the way it is. So that would be my recommendation, is to remove that branch all the way to the ground if the plant is throwing up some suckers, and you can be reasonably sure it's going to come back. You maybe don't have to remove every branch to the ground either. If you don't mind, you might just be able to cut back that one individual stem. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, send me an email. I'll give you with a picture.
She said thanks. And then Barb was wondering, she has a maple tree with multiple trunks, so a multi-stem maple tree. Should it be pruned more like a shrub or more like a tree?
Yeah, some of those multi-stem ones are a little tricky. But generally for those multi-stem ones, what I would recommend is treating each stem of the multi-stem tree like it was its own tree, right? So each multiple stem should have its own central leader and small lateral branches. So I would treat it more like a tree. That's the way I would approach that one. Anything else? Otherwise, I did think I found the video.
Mary Pat wonders, there are 2 Cheyenne mock oranges that are probably 10 years old and have never been pruned. Can they be rejuvenated?
Right. So
orange, I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I mean, you can mock orange. I generally think will tolerate rejuvenation, but the key is, so this is the key to determining yes or no rejuvenation is look at the shrub, and if it's putting up new growth from the base every year, if there's suckers coming from the root system or water sprouts coming from the base, it's almost certainly going to tolerate rejuvenation. If you don't see any suckers coming from the roots or water sprouts coming from the lower parts of the shrub, rejuvenation you may have to wait to rejuvenate, or the shrub may not tolerate it. So if you see the suckers from the base, I'd say go for it. If you don't see suckers, I would thin it the first year and then rejuvenate it in year 2 or 3 after some new sucker growth is coming out from the base.
It sounds like it is suckering. So Mary Pat, good luck. Oh, she's going to see how brave she is.
Good. We're all about.
Scary thing to cut a shrub all the way down.
It is, yeah, for sure.
Those are all the questions so far. So if you want to show your video.
Yep. Is my screen still being shared as the video, or is it being shared as, what's it look like on your end?
It looks like the PowerPoint. So you haven't started the PowerPoint yet. Yeah, and now it's gone. And then Kim, I'll answer your question with Russian sage, mow it down. I mow mine with the lawnmower, but if you want to cut it back with your hands, you can. Russian sage is more of a perennial. We treat it, it's semi-woody, but we treat it more as a perennial. So yeah, mow it down to the ground. I literally take my lawnmower and mow it down. Smells good too. That's probably not the recommended pruning practice. So if Eric, you have something else that's a little more sophisticated, you could
No,
on.
no. Russian sage is a problem to me. So
Yeah.
I take it to the ground every year.
Mhm.
Are you seeing the video now, Allison?
I am seeing the video. Yep.
Okay, so let's do it real quick. It's just a couple minutes.
Today we're talking about pruning shrubs for Plant Talk Colorado. First, you want to make sure you're using the proper tools for the job. Hand pruners are great for branches less than an inch in diameter, and loppers are used for larger branches. You can also use a hand saw or a sawzall. Every few years, certain species can really benefit from pruning. It can help increase flower production, reduce the size of overgrown shrubs, and get rid of dead or unruly branches. For these two shrubs, we're going to demonstrate renewal pruning and rejuvenation pruning. Rejuvenation pruning is the complete removal of stems from old and overgrown shrubs. This allows fresh new growth to take their place. To do rejuvenation pruning, cut all of the stems down to about 6 inches above ground level. When doing renewal pruning, ideally you'll remove 1/3 of the oldest, woodiest stems by
Well, okay. So if the video is not playing, I'm not going to bother showing it, but we can link the video in chat and you can all watch it on your own time on your own computers. Does that sound good?
It was, so Eric, it was like advancing, but like more like photographs as opposed to actually being a video. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
You
good to
can
know. Here,
see the concepts of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we know that doesn't work now. So here's the link in chat for everyone if you want to watch it after class. So we'll just go on with the PowerPoint. I saw there were some questions too. Miss Kim Lilacs. Miss Kim Lilacs will tolerate rejuvenation. Again, forever. It's pretty safe. Not days. You want to make sure you're not dealing with the grafted right there. And I think
So
that's
Eric,
all the questions.
you broke up quite a bit on my end. I don't know if you did for the rest of the people, but you might want to repeat that about Miss Kim. And there is one more question after you're finished.
Okay. Let me close YouTube. My rural internet is really crummy. That's probably why I closed it the first time. That's probably why I was skipping too. Okay, so how am I sounding? Bad? Good?
Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah.
Okay. So for Miss Kim, lilacs of all types, as far at least all the shrub forms, will definitely tolerate rejuvenation. Just make sure it's suckering at the base, just like I mentioned before. So that's your ultimate test. If it's suckering from the base or has a lot of water sprouts from down low, it'll probably tolerate rejuvenation. Be careful. I think Miss Kim is on its own roots. I'm almost sure of that. But if it's not, you want to be very careful about doing rejuvenation with it. I don't think they put lilacs grafted or they'd sucker like crazy. They just can't.
Yeah, I could try to look, but I think you're right. It's on its own roots.
I don't think they graft lilacs. It would just be a disaster.
They propagate pretty easily from cutting. So.
Yeah.
And then Annie wanted to know if you can elaborate on types of hydrangeas. So like, I know that some hydrangeas bloom on old wood, some bloom on new wood, and that's might be a conversation for another day, because that gets into some more details about cultivars.
Yeah. So the two hydrangeas that we can really grow in Colorado very well are smooth hydrangea and Annabelle hydrangea, and both of those flower on. I believe they both flower on new growth, because I usually just take them to the ground every year, let them come back from the base. Or they may flower on both if they're in a more temperate climate. They may flower on both new and old growth, which some plants do as well. Those are the two types of hydrangeas that really do well here. I mean, I know that they sell a lot of the really showy, and their name is escaping me now, but the really showy, gosh, what is the name of those ones? They sell them on Mother's Day. They're blue, but they
Endless Summer or Bloomstruck or Strawberries and Cream. Yeah.
So.
And I think those are technically a type of Annabelle, but I have never had any success growing them here. I have found it to be too dry, but I'm a very dry gardener.
And our soil is the other thing with a lot of hydrangeas.
Yeah.
Like Some of them just don't like our alkaline soils, and some of them, and then our cold winters. You know,
Mhm.
if you're from the Northwest or the Northeast or the South, there's just a lot more hydrangea options available to you out there. So cool. Hopefully that answered the question at least a little bit.
Those
Hopefully
are
everyone,
all the questions. Wait, nope, there's more. Hold on. So Annie, you really, I'll just answer it, Eric. It was about hydrangeas. Should you cut them down to the ground? You need to figure out when they bloom and if they're blooming on old or new wood. And that's when you can determine when you cut them.
yeah.
And then Sonia, why would someone choose to cut back or not cut back their red twig dogwood?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good question. So this is a little bit of an abbreviated version of the talk. I've got another one where I talk about red twig dogwoods a little bit, but lots of times red twig dogwoods, people will choose to every year, every 2 or 3 years, cut them all the way to the ground, because the new growth on redwood twig dogwoods is a much brighter red. And so by cutting them back all the time, you ensure there's lots of new bright red young growth, and you get that winter interest from the red twigs, which is like 90% of the reason to plant a red twig dogwood around these parts. So it encourages them to look more red, would be the short answer. Same with yellow twig, etc.
And then there was just a clarification. When do you prune summer growth on new wood?
When do you prune summer growth on new wood?
When?
So maybe whoever asked that can clarify. Are you asking like about when to prune summer? Okay, so summer growth on new wood. So you're saying there's growth midsummer and you want to prune it? I'm not sure. I don't want to give you a long diatribe and not even answer the question. So I just
That's
want to
how I would read it. So yes, yeah.
So most of our shrubs, unless you're pruning them, like shearing them, they will have they are determinate. Like they're like determinate tomatoes. They'll have one flush of growth. There are some indeterminate shrubs that will have multiple flushes of growth, and on those, I suppose you might want to prune off some of the new growth to keep them looking more uniform or something like that. In which case, I would say just do it whenever. I'd consider that branch by branch shaping. Just do it as needed to keep the shrub looking uniform. Other than that, though, generally I'd say do most of your pruning on summer blooming shrubs before they leaf out, and on spring blooming shrubs right after they bloom. And other than that, you do very little pruning on flowering shrubs. And hopefully that was a good enough answer.
And for those, I don't even want to bring it up because then you're going to get 100 questions about roses, but Roger Hines, who is a rosarian and a master gardener, just did a 2-hour lecture on roses, and he covers pruning roses pretty extensively. So that's also on the CMG online, and it's listed towards the top, and he just did that a couple weeks ago. So you can check out that, because roses are a shrub, but they are a little bit different in terms of their pruning needs.
Yeah. I have no luck with roses. You don't want to ask my opinion about how to prune them because it'll just be, well, incorrect probably.
Maybe a lawnmower, Eric. I don't know. No,
Cool.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding, everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That is all the questions for now.
Okay. So we didn't get the video, but you can see, you know, kind of the differences between the different pruning methods. So let's talk now about the one I've kind of alluded to a lot, the method which I'm going to call shear to shape. You could also just call it shearing. So this is an aronia that's been sheared, and you can see right where it's sheared, right? Branches are straight, and then all of a sudden they have a lot of branching, and they're very dense. And that's what shearing to shape does to shrubs. You know, here's some examples of it around. Some shrubs tolerate it really well. This is a barberry. They tolerate shearing pretty well. You know, here's that other picture I showed you. Here's some, I think these were Japanese or malled spirea that are getting sheared, which is crazy because they're going to be small anyways. I don't know why you'd shear them, and they're looking a little chlorotic. So when we shear shrubs, the thing, you know, we're indiscriminately taking off growth. We're probably losing flower buds. And unless we really want to hedge, what we're doing is essentially impairing that shrub's ability to flower or, you know, generally look good in the landscape. So I just have some kind of horror story sort of pictures here. These are wayfaring tree viburnums. These are the exact same shrub I showed you pictures of earlier in front of that building. They want to be about 12 feet tall. They flower on old wood, and here they're shearing them the size of basketballs. They're not hiding that fence. I mean, these shrubs are not doing anything for the landscape. If I was in charge of it, I'd want them gone and just let's mow turf. That's easier and probably cheaper in this case, right? They're not doing anything for the landscape anyways. Here they are from a different perspective. A landscape architect actually got this right? You know, although some of that grass you're never going to see in between the big tall shrubs, but they're hiding the fence. They picked nice tall shrubs to hide the fence, and they're just being sheared into these balls. This is sand cherry, which is a kind of a ground cover sort of shrub. It'll spread along the ground, grow a couple feet high, but just kind of ramble. And they're shearing it back to the size of a basketball. And you can see how the shearing affects its growth habit. Again, flowers on old wood. So all that pruning is taking off flower buds and impairing this shrub's ability to look nice, to have flowers. And, you know, those are the reasons why we planted it. Here we can see this is a Tatarian honeysuckle, which wants to have this arching habit. And you can see it wants to arch, but they keep shearing off the arches. And so it kind of has this really dense growth at the top, and then not much going on other parts of the shrub. Just looks, I mean, to me, horrible. Again, I'm like, why are we dealing with this? Viburnum opulus, snowball bush viburnum. Look how dense these are where they shear it. I mean, that is dense, right? And they're shearing off a lot of flower buds when they do that, because again, they bloom on old wood. I mean, that is a very dense shrub, and they're already prone to foliar diseases and stuff. It's just going to encourage all that. Just not helpful. And here's that same planting from a distance. They're not being a good screen, et cetera, because they're being sheared. And that whole planting from a distance of all the stuff being sheared into little balls. So I already talked about that. Now here, okay, we have a different planting. So if you want small, neat shrubs, which is a lot of the reason people want things to be sheared, is they want them to be orderly, neat, and small. The best bet is really to plant something small and neat. These were Bemald spirea, small little plant. They're in like a 3 foot gap here between the Good Times and fast food restaurant and the curb. And they're perfect there. They probably never have to get pruned, probably never have to get thought about. So it's the first thing you're taught is, you know, when you get into horticulture, right plant, right place. If you want it to be more neat and orderly and small, don't try to make 18 foot or 12 to 18 foot shrub be the size of a basketball. Plant a shrub that wants to be the size of a basketball. So, you know, my personal soapboxing aside, shearing to shape is often thought of as quick and easy. I kind of dispute that. I keep threatening this, but one day I want to do a video where I race somebody thinning a shrub versus shearing it and see who is done first from the start of the job to the finish of the job, because shearing requires getting the hedge trimmers working, and then it requires cleaning up all the little branches that come off the shrub with a rake. It's quite time intensive, and then loading up with the car. Whereas when you thin, you just have to grab like the 3, 4, 5, 6 branches you thin out. They're big long branches, easy to pick up, put them all in the car once, and you're done. Also have to make a few cuts. So some people say it's quick and easy. I kind of question that. It creates a very unnatural shape, for better or worse. Does not encourage new growth from flowering. You get that dense outer shell, very little light reaching the interior of the shrub, so not a lot of new growth to be that vigorous flower growth. Plus, you're shearing off a lot of flower buds, especially if it's a spring blooming shrub. Gosh, I feel like I ramble on about this longer normally. So you can probably tell, though, that I think that most landscape shrubs do not need to be sheared unless it's a hedge that you're trying to create. They should instead be thinned, shaped, or rejuvenated. It took me forever. I always tell the story. We had these big forsythia bushes when I was growing up at home, and I didn't know forsythia had yellow flowers until I went away to college and took a class, because my dad, probably just trying to stay away from my mom, would shear them every other weekend. And so he was always shearing off the flower buds. And so, there might have been a few stray yellow flowers, but I never noticed them as a child. So anyways, so, we should be focusing on other types of pruning when it comes to most flowering shrubs. So I saw at least one thing in the chat, which I believe, look at here. Meatball shrubs, yeah. Okay, so we'll end up, this is the last topic, with just a little bit of talk about pruning evergreen shrubs, and this will cover some stuff that applies to trees as well. I won't probably get into the full evergreen tree thing, but we can just talk a little about this because we have time. So the biggest thing about evergreens to understand is that in general, they are not tolerant to pruning. If you can, and you're planting them, plant them in a place where they can be their full mature size without any pruning being needed. Super important. If you inherit shrubs that need to be pruned, you have to understand a few things. If you prune back past live green growth, almost always that you will not get new growth back to where you pruned. You'll leave an empty hole. The needles are out at the tips, and the plant will not produce new needles to the interior of the canopy just because you prune back further. So this hollow part of this juniper is, not going to really fill in. Eventually the sides may grow up and hide. They may grow taller and hide the hole, but it'll never get new growth to the interior there. Also, it's important to understand that if you're shearing evergreens, which is pretty commonly done for junipers and things like that, you're going to get the same effect as when you shear a flowering shrub. You're going to create a dense outer layer of foliage that shades out the interior. And eventually what happens is that kind of layer gets thinner and thinner every time, especially if you shear a lot. And eventually it gets kind of like thin and holy looking, like it's got a bunch of holes in it. So we'd rather see most evergreens thinned, which is just going in and making targeted cuts at the junction of branches to keep the shrub having its natural shape and something close to its natural density. So yeah, if you shear junipers all the time, this is what they look like, right? They get thin on the side where you're shearing them. They're more prone to scorch, windburn, and all that too. And I don't know who in their right mind, when they made this plan, spec'd a juniper for a 12-inch space, right? They probably read some nursery catalog that said this juniper would stay small. And that's just never the case, right? They always get big. And now they got to shear back all the time. So that said, if you have a tree form juniper, you can shear it maybe once a year or something without it making it look too bad. The more sun they get, the more tolerant they are of shearing. The more they're in shade, the less tolerant they are of shearing. So you want to shear them lightly and infrequently if you have junipers that need shearing. That's the goal. For spreading junipers, oftentimes you see what's going on up here in this picture where they spread out into the grass or a sidewalk and you have to cut them back. If you just shear them back, you're going to get that mat of foliage on the top and these kind of branchy, twiggy thing on the bottom. It's much better to prune them back instead of like shearing them like this, to prune them back. So to follow these branches that are out too far back and look for an upward growing lateral branch somewhere back here and prune back to that. And ideally, you're starting that before it outgrows itself. So you'll start trying to prune it back with targeted cuts before it outgrows the space. You'll do it preemptively, and it's going to look a lot better. So yeah, again, when you make those targeted cuts, you follow the stem back to an upward growing lateral branch, and that's where you make the cut. And the idea is here that this branch now takes over and grows and arches down and hides the cut you are making, so you don't get that hollow or patchy look when you do this. So you can see some cuts here, back to an upward growing branch, back to an upward growing lateral branch, back to an upward lateral growing branch. And that can be pretty time consuming. And on top of that, a lot of us have an allergic reaction to junipers. I was told once by someone who said they were a doctor that it's actually the most common allergy that Americans have is a mild allergy to junipers, where your skin will get red because you touch them. I don't think it's very commonly like a life-threatening thing, but very often it's an irritant to people. So be extra careful sighting them so you don't have to do much of the pruning. For pines, there are a lot of shrub pines we plant. Most of them are mugos, but there are other ones. Pines are the least tolerant of pruning of all evergreens. They have very few side buds, which makes them super prone to looking really bad after they're pruned. You get like stubs like this, things like that. They're not tolerant of pruning. Never cut a pine in the middle of a branch. I see it done all the time. You'll always end up with a stub. Instead, with pines, what we do is pinching. So pinching is done when the new candle growth is happening in the spring. So it's a time right about now or within the next few weeks. The new growth is elongating. We grab that new growth and we pinch off the tip. You still get buds developing behind where you pinch, so you don't like create a hole. So that's good. And you reduce the growth of the plant significantly. So If you've got a Mugo pine that's too big, like by a entryway or something by a sidewalk, every spring you can just spend a quick 5-10 minutes going through and pinching all the new growth off halfway down or something like that. It does not take very long. You can also use pruners, though pruners you tend to cut like these little needle primordia down here, these like needles that are starting, you tend to cut them, and sometimes they can make your shrub, make your pine look a little funny. Spruce and Douglas fir are both more tolerant to pruning than pines. They have more lateral buds that you can cut back to. So you can do heading cuts or in addition to like removal or reduction cuts and still have success. Still, when you do head them back, they tend to look funny, right? So like, yes, that spruce is not hollow. It's got new growth where it's being sheared, but it doesn't look normal, right? Probably no tree is planted in the wrong site more than Colorado blue spruce. Everyone thinks they need one, and everyone puts it too close to their house, sideway, drive walk, etc. Because when they come from the nursery, they're teeny tiny little things, and they're so cute. You don't realize they're going to be 30 feet across at the base when they get mature. So lots of times people want to do something like this and shear them or want to lift them. And like I said, you can lift them if you need to, but you should do it slowly and not lift them too far, or you increase the risk of failure. I was always told this is because you make an umbrella and then the wind gets underneath the spruce and lifts it up. I don't think that can possibly be true. A spruce and the root system and all the soil that the spruce system are hooked to are heavy, heavy, heavy. I think it's more likely by lifting it up, you change the pivot point and create more of a lever on the root system. I've never read any science about that, but the physics of it make more sense. So with spruce and with all conifers, again, right plant, right place is the most important thing to remember. I've already talked about tools. The one tool that's on here that I haven't talked about is this Sawzall here. A Sawzall is a reciprocating saw that goes back and forth, and they make pruning blades for them now. So just way safer than a chainsaw if you don't want to get a hand-operated saw. Good for branches, I'd say up to 2 to 4 inches. Does not make as clean a cut as a razor saw, but again, it's a little less work. So I think Sawzall is a great tool for pruning shrubs. I also think loppers are a good tool for pruning shrub, much better tool than they are for trees. So it's something you might want to consider. Okay, so that's the end of the shrub pruning talk, and that's pretty much what I had for y'all. So I'm happy to hang out here. I can if I stop sharing, I can see the chat. I can see it actually anyways, but if I stop sharing, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have. Thanks for hanging in there with me. That took a little longer than I thought it would to get through.
Yeah, you guys are troopers. I think you deserve a big round of applause. Thank you. A couple house cleaning tips while you type in your questions for Eric, if there are any. Remember that everyone who is a trainee is expected to complete the final exam. This will be posted or opened in Canvas. So you will re-enter Canvas and take the final exam. It's 50 questions, and you are expected to get 70% or better. Now, you can do this over as long a period as you want. I have set my final date to be April 30th. And if you don't want to do it in one fell swoop, you can just exit out of the browser. But once you hit submit, it is submitted. So make sure that you are ready to submit when you do that. And then there's also a overall training survey that we'd love for you to complete that's also in Canvas, right listed below the final exam. So if there are no further questions, it is 3:36. I see a glimpse of sun outside here in Windsor. And if you do have questions, be sure to contact me, Eric, any of your county coordinators. We will get this recording up online as soon as we can. And you guys are amazing. Eric, thank you for taking the time this afternoon to do this. And we appreciate everything. And then take advantage of the webinars that are coming up. There's a lot of them. You could spend all of your days on Zoom, which I don't think anybody wants to, but you could. So you could go ahead and do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll grab it real quick. We've got most of them now on a page because Allison's awesome.
Eric is awesome and had a great idea.
Okay. But here's the link. So if you want to, there's a bunch of random webinars posted there. Things like this that, are just a little less formal and shorter, but you're welcome to tune into any of them.
Absolutely. And we do have a capacity of 300 people. So holy moly, if we get 300 people for our classes, I don't know what we'd do with ourselves. So yeah, so check out the links. And again, Eric typed in his email address, contact us. Everybody have a really wonderful weekend. Stay safe out there, make good choices, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, Eric.